Long before Shambhala appeared in Buddhist texts, the Himalayas had already become a natural frontier of hidden valleys and protected cultures. The Tibetan Plateau and surrounding Himalayan region constitute one of the most geophysically complex areas on Earth. Spanning over 2.5 million square kilometers, the plateau averages 4,500 meters in elevation, bordered by the high ranges of the Karakoram, Pamirs, and the main Himalayan chain. Archaeological surveys and topographic analyses indicate that this combination of altitude, rugged terrain, and extreme climate created a natural barrier to large-scale migration and external invasions, fostering isolated pockets of human settlement. Early agrarian communities concentrated in river valleys such as the Yarlung Tsongpa, Indus tributaries, and the Brahmaputra headwaters, taking advantage of seasonal meltwater for irrigation. Evidence from Neolithic sites in the Qinghai and western Tibet regions, including stone tools and early ceramics, supports sustained occupation from as early as 3000 BCE, indicating a gradual adaptation to high-altitude ecological constraints. Between 500 BCE and 600 CE, the plateau and adjoining Himalayan regions exhibited a diverse cultural mosaic. Archaeologists uncovered remains of fortified settlements in the western Himalayas, particularly in Ladakh and the Zanskar Valley, suggesting small-scale political entities capable of controlling strategic passes. Trade networks linked these settlements with the Darim Basin to the north and Kashmir to the west, facilitating the exchange of agricultural products, livestock, and high-value items such as lapis lazuli and medicinal herbs. Early Chinese accounts, including those of the Buddhist monk Faxian in the 5th century CE, describe caravan routes through high mountain passes, confirming the existence of organized long-distance trade and cultural transmission. These networks allowed the circulation of religious ideas, technological knowledge, and artistic motifs, which later contributed to the textual framing of remote Himalayan realms. The region's climate and ecological conditions further reinforced its inaccessibility. Annual precipitation varies considerably, with arid plateaus juxtaposed against monsoon-influenced southern slopes. Temperature extremes, often exceeding 30 degrees Celsius in summer and dropping below -20 degrees Celsius in winter, constrained permanent settlement to valleys and river basins. According to paleoenvironmental reconstructions from lake sediment cores in western Tibet, glacial advance and retreat cycles shaped available arable land and settlement patterns, producing periods of demographic contraction and expansion. These environmental limitations imposed logistical and political constraints, limiting the ability of centralized polities to establish sustained control across the entire plateau. Archaeological surveys in remote valleys show minimal evidence of large-scale fortifications or urban centers, supporting the view that high-altitude isolation was a defining characteristic of the region. The interplay of geography, climate, and human adaptation also created the conditions for highly localized cultural development. Isolated communities maintained distinct material cultures, reflected in pottery styles, burial practices, and rock art. For example, petroglyphs in Upper Mustang and Western Tibet depict animals, abstract motifs, and early ritual symbols, suggesting both spiritual and social organization adapted to ecological constraints. Scholars note that these culturally autonomous settlements facilitated the retention of oral traditions and localized mythologies, which would later converge in Tibetan Buddhist cosmology. Such conditions provided the conceptual template for the idea of a concealed kingdom, where geography itself contributed to notions of remoteness and protection from external influence. From a systemic perspective, the combination of rugged topography, variable climate, and established trade corridors illustrates how ecological and economic factors influenced political and cultural formation in the early Himalayan world. These highland settlements operated within a networked yet decentralized system, demonstrating a balance between isolation and connectivity. This balance provided both practical security and the conceptual foundation for later textual constructions of hidden or utopian regions. In particular, the pattern of high-altitude valleys supporting small but resilient communities appears in early Tibetan and Central Asian texts as symbolic markers of remoteness, which Buddhist authors would later integrate into descriptions of Shambhala. Interpretively, The adaptation of communities to environmental constraints demonstrates three key dynamics. First, isolated valleys served as natural fortresses that preserved local traditions over centuries. Second, trade and limited mobility allowed selective transmission of ideas without compromising isolation. And third, environmental hardship shaped social hierarchies and ritual practices that would inform later mythic narratives. This systemic integration of ecology, economy, and social structure set the stage for the conceptual emergence of Shambhala as a hidden northern kingdom, where both geography and governance reinforced its inaccessibility. As Himalayan societies matured, textual traditions began forming that would eventually reference a concealed northern kingdom. In early Indic cosmology, distant northern lands already symbolized order, purity, and spiritual advancement. The conceptual foundation of Shambhala draws on a long-standing Indic tradition of remote, idealized kingdoms. Texts such as the Mahabharata, compiled between 400 BCE and 400 CE, and various Puranas reference northern regions like Uttarakuru, described as lands beyond the Himalayas inhabited by virtuous peoples untouched by ordinary social and political conflicts. Archaeological surveys and epigraphic studies suggest that these textual accounts were informed by real geographic awareness of the trans-Himalayan frontier, including trade and migration routes connecting northern India with the Darim Basin and Central Asia. Uttarakuru, in particular, appears consistently as a site of abundance, longevity, and ritual purity, indicating that early Indic authors conceptualized distant lands as spaces where moral and cosmological order could persist uncorrupted. Linguistically, the term Shambhala appears in pre-Buddhist Sanskrit lexica as a nominal reference to peace, welfare, or tranquility, derived from the root sam, meaning harmony or calm. In this context, Shambhala functioned less as a concrete polity than as a descriptor of an idealized state. Philological studies confirm that by the first millennium CE, the term was occasionally associated with northern realms, reflecting a continuity of utopian motifs. Textual evidence, including the Vayu and Brahma Puranas, situates these realms beyond the Himalayan watershed, linking geography with moral and spiritual qualities. This early semantic framework provided a lexical and conceptual bridge for later Buddhist reinterpretations, particularly within the Kalachakra corpus, where Shambhala evolves into a named kingdom with lineage and eschatological significance. The spread of Indic cosmological motifs into Central Asia further contextualizes the emergence of Shambhala. Historical records indicate that between 500 BCE and 500 CE, trade routes such as the Northern Silk Road facilitated the movement of texts, religious ideas, and cosmological concepts. Archaeologists have recovered manuscript fragments in Gandhara, Khotan, and Dunhuang that include references to northern utopias and celestial kingdoms, reflecting a cross-cultural circulation of motifs. These sources indicate that early Indic concepts of remote, sacred lands were not confined to the subcontinent, but were part of a broader Eurasian intellectual network, influencing both early Buddhist and Central Asian cosmologies. Such transmission demonstrates the interaction between geography, textual tradition, and cultural imagination in shaping enduring mythic structures. In these early Indic references, the northern lands are consistently depicted as both isolated and morally exemplary. The Mahabharata's description of Uttarakuru emphasizes its separation from ordinary human conflict and its preservation of dharma. Similarly, the Vishnu Purana and Matsya Purana portray northern territories as repositories of spiritual discipline and social stability, accessible primarily to the virtuous or spiritually advanced. This dual emphasis on isolation and ethical order parallels later textual treatments of Shambhala, suggesting that the concept's geographic and moral dimensions were prefigured in earlier Indic thought. Scholars interpret this as evidence that Shambhala's mythic geography represents a synthesis of real-world perception and idealized social modeling, a pattern observed repeatedly in ancient utopian literature. Interpretively, three dynamics emerge from this early Indic framework. First, distant northern lands functioned as symbolic stabilizers, representing order and continuity in contrast to politically fragmented or contested regions in the subcontinent. Second, Textual and linguistic references to such lands were often deliberately ambiguous, allowing later traditions to overlay doctrinal content without contradicting prior cosmologies. Third, the circulation of these motifs across Central Asia indicates that conceptual models of hidden or sacred lands were mobile, adaptable to diverse geographic and cultural contexts. These dynamics provide insight into how textual ideas can prefigure later institutional and doctrinal constructions, particularly when combined with the expansion of Buddhism into new regions. Evidence of these early conceptualizations is supported by philological and archaeological data. Manuscript fragments recovered from sites such as the Kizil Caves and Dunhuang include Sanskrit and Prakrit references to Uttarakuru and associated northern utopias, confirming the persistence of these motifs in trade and religious contexts. Additionally, early inscriptions, such as those found in the Mathura region, reference northern peoples and territories as morally distinct or ritually significant. These sources indicate that textual and material culture intersected to reinforce ideas of distant, idealized realms, creating a conceptual scaffolding for the later Kalachakra portrayal of Shambhala. By the end of the first millennium CE, the conceptualization of remote northern kingdoms had become sufficiently established to influence emerging Buddhist literature. These early Indic models provided both terminology and geographic imagination, enabling later Tibetan scholars to locate Shambhala within a northern, protected landscape while embedding it in a complex eschatological framework. The transition from general utopian motifs to a specific doctrinally elaborated kingdom illustrates the continuity and adaptation of Indic intellectual traditions across centuries. As Buddhism expanded northward, these early Indic motifs merged with new doctrinal developments, creating the textual basis for Shambhala as a defined kingdom. By the 8th century CE, Buddhist scholasticism had entered the Himalayas, bringing with it a complex cosmology ready for reinterpretation. The expansion of Buddhism into the Tibetan Plateau and adjacent Himalayan regions between the 7th and 9th centuries CE marked a transformative period in both religious and cultural history. Historical sources, including Tibetan annals and the Dunhuang manuscripts, indicate that early Tibetan kings such as Songtsen Gampo, c. 617 to 650 CE, actively promoted the reception of Buddhist teachings from northern India and Central Asia. Archaeological evidence from temple foundations in the Yarlung Valley, alongside inscriptions on stone steels, corroborates these accounts. The introduction of canonical texts required systematic translation of Sanskrit scriptures into Tibetan, a process coordinated by scholar translators like Thonmi Sambhoda. These translation efforts not only transmitted doctrinal content but also introduced a complex cosmological vocabulary, including early references to northern sacred geographies that would later inform the conception of Shambhala. The establishment of monastic centers played a central role in consolidating this religious and intellectual expansion. Early monastic institutions such as Sami, founded in the late 8th century under the patronage of King Trisong Detsen, became focal points for both ritual practice and scholarly study. Archaeological excavations at Sami and surrounding sites reveal a combination of Indian Vihara architectural influence and local Himalayan adaptations, demonstrating the integration of foreign doctrinal traditions within a highland environment. These centers facilitated the codification of esoteric teachings, particularly tantric practices, which required controlled transmission within monastic networks. The concentration of textual and ritual expertise in these institutions created conditions conducive to the elaboration of new conceptual geographies, including the notion of protected northern realms suitable for esoteric kingship. Concurrently, political consolidation in the highlands established the territorial and social framework necessary for such ideological developments. Tibetan polities maintained strategic control over valleys, passes, and trade routes connecting the plateau with Kashmir, Nepal, and the Darim Basin. Early Tibetan inscriptions, such as the Yarlung pillar inscriptions, document administrative efforts to manage tributary regions and maintain surveillance over these high-altitude corridors. These territorial arrangements allowed monastic institutions to operate with relative autonomy while ensuring protection from external interference. The political geography of highland kingdoms thus intersected with religious expansion, creating a networked environment in which abstract cosmological ideas could be localized and associated with specific topographical features. The introduction of esoteric Buddhist doctrines, including early proto-Kalachakra teachings, further exemplifies this process. Textual analyses indicate that Vajrayana and Tantric systems were introduced into Tibet via both Indian pundits and Central Asian intermediaries during this period. Manuscript fragments from Dunhuang and early Tibetan collections reveal terminology and ritual prescriptions linked to celestial kingships, cyclical time, and northern sacred spaces. These motifs were embedded within the existing Indic conceptual framework of northern utopias, providing a doctrinal scaffolding for the eventual emergence of Shambhala. Scholars note that the combination of geographic isolation, political security, and monastic centralization enabled the elaboration of complex esoteric cosmologies that aligned with pre-existing utopian motifs from earlier Indic literature. Interpretive analysis of this period suggests three key dynamics. First, the physical and political seclusion of monastic centers allowed for sustained scholarly activity, which was critical in preserving, translating, and systematizing Indic and Central Asian texts. Second, trade and communication routes ensured selective exposure to external ideas, enabling adaptation without compromising the autonomy of Himalayan institutions. Third, the interaction between esoteric doctrines and local geographic awareness fostered a conceptual linkage between spiritual authority and physical remoteness. Together, these factors created a receptive environment for textual constructions of northern realms that combined cosmology, kingship, and protected geography. Material and textual evidence reinforces these interpretations. Architectural remains at Sami and other early monasteries indicate the adoption of Indian temple planning alongside adaptations for local topography. Stone inscriptions from the 8th and 9th centuries document royal patronage of scholarly activities and the import of texts. Manuscript discoveries at Dunhuang and early Tibetan sites provide evidence of translation lineages, doctrinal commentary, and ritual instruction that situate northern sacred spaces within emerging Buddhist cosmology. This evidence underscores the systematic integration of physical, political, and intellectual infrastructures necessary for the later elaboration of Shambhala. By the end of the 9th century CE, Tibetan monastic and political institutions had firmly established both the material and ideological foundations for the transmission of advanced Buddhist cosmology. The region's isolation, coupled with deliberate cultivation of scholarly networks, allowed complex doctrinal systems to flourish, linking geography, ritual, and governance. This environment was essential for the conceptual emergence of Shambhala as a defined northern kingdom within Buddhist eschatology, setting the stage for its first detailed textual appearance in the Kalachakra corpus. With these cultural and textual frameworks in place, Shambhala first appeared in a specific Buddhist corpus, the Kalachakra. In the Kalachakra corpus, Shambhala emerged not as metaphor but as a structured kingdom with lineages, rulers, and historical cycles. The Kalachakra Tantra, composed between the 10th and 11th centuries CE, represents a major development within Buddhist esoteric literature, combining tantric ritual, cosmology, and historical narrative. Historical and philological scholarship places its composition in either the Kashmir region of northern India or the neighboring trans-Himalayan cultural zones of Central Asia, with evidence supporting both hypotheses. Manuscript analysis of early Sanskrit texts, such as the Vimalaprabha commentary, shows that the core corpus was systematically structured to integrate doctrinal, cosmological, and socio-political elements. Archaeological and textual records indicate that centers of tantric scholarship in Kashmir and eastern Afghanistan were actively producing and circulating texts during this period, facilitating the Kalachakra's compilation and dissemination. The Kalachakra Tantra is distinctive in its integration of multiple layers of knowledge. It provides a detailed cosmology, outlining the structure of the universe in concentric spheres, planetary cycles, and temporal frameworks. It also incorporates a geopolitical narrative, describing Shambhala as a northern kingdom with a sequence of 32 Kalki kings, each presiding over a lineage that blends historical memory with eschatological projection. The text situates Shambhala beyond the Himalayan watershed, geographically isolated, yet accessible through esoteric knowledge and ritual practice. These spatial and temporal coordinates reflect both inherited Indic utopian motifs, such as Uttarakuru, and locally adapted highland geographic awareness, producing a synthesized doctrinal geography. Competing scholarly interpretations of the Kalachakra's provenance underscore the complexity of its composition. Some scholars, including John Newman and David Rigel, argue for an Indian origin in the Kashmir region, based on linguistic style, references to Indian social structures, and connections to earlier tantric systems. Others propose a Central Asian or Trans-Himalayan context, citing manuscript discoveries in Dunhuang, Khotan, and Turfan that reflect early circulation and adaptation of the text beyond India. Archaeological evidence from these regions, including reliquary inscriptions and monastic foundations aligned with tantric practice, suggests that Kalachakra teachings were integrated into local religious networks contemporaneously with their composition. The debate over provenance highlights the Kalachakra Tantra's function as a trans-regional work, reflecting the mobility of ideas and ritual expertise across the highlands and northern subcontinent. Within this corpus, Shambhala is presented as a fully elaborated geopolitical entity. The text enumerates dynastic succession, with each Kalki king associated with specific temporal periods, moral qualities, and ritual obligations. The kingdom itself is described in terms of its social organization, including administrative structures, military contingents, and population distribution. Records in the Vimalapprabha commentary clarify that Shambhala's boundaries, though conceptually remote, were envisioned with sufficient specificity to support ritual and eschatological operations. This level of detail distinguishes Shambhala from earlier Indic utopias, which emphasized ethical or moral characteristics over territorial or administrative structures. The cosmological framework of the Kalachakra is inseparable from its historical narrative. The text situates Shambhala within cycles of time, connecting the rise and fall of kings to broader cosmic rhythms. These cycles operate on multiple scales: planetary, annual, and epochal. The interaction between human governance and cosmic order illustrates the tantric integration of ritual, astrology, and statecraft. Textual references to celestial phenomena and calendrical calculations demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, consistent with contemporaneous Indian and Central Asian scholastic traditions. This combination of cosmic and political modeling provided a structured eschatological horizon in which Shambhala could act as both a temporal and spiritual center. Three interpretive insights emerge from the Kalachakra's presentation of Shambhala. First, the text demonstrates the capacity of tantric systems to produce fully articulated socio-political models within a doctrinal framework. Second, the localization of Shambhala in northern, highland geography reflects a continued interaction between textual imagination and environmental awareness. Third, the embedding of cyclical temporal structures illustrates how eschatology and governance were conceptualized as mutually reinforcing processes, linking ritual practice to moral and cosmic order. Together, these features establish Shambhala as a unique intersection of doctrine, geography, and history. Material and textual evidence supports these observations. Surviving Sanskrit manuscripts, including the Vimalapprabha and early commentarial glosses, provide detailed genealogies and ritual instructions. Dunhuang fragments corroborate the transregional transmission and adaptation of Kalachakra material, while Tibetan translations from the 11th and 12th centuries demonstrate the text's integration into monastic scholastic practice. These sources collectively indicate that Shambhala's representation was neither metaphorical nor incidental, but constituted a deliberate doctrinal innovation with sustained ritual and historical significance. By the conclusion of the 11th century, the Kalachakra Tantra had firmly established Shambhala as a defined kingdom with lineage, territory, and eschatological purpose. Its composition marked the first moment in which Shambhala was systematically located within a comprehensive Buddhist cosmology, providing subsequent Tibetan scholars with a structured framework for textual exegesis, ritual application, and geographic imagination. This doctrinal embedding set the stage for Shambhala's continued development in Tibetan religious literature and its later role as both a spiritual and cultural reference point. The Kalachakra then elaborated a structured chronology that placed Shambhala firmly into Buddhist historical cycles. The Shambhala texts detailed a royal lineage with a precision rarely applied to mythic realms. The Kalachakra Tantra presents Shambhala as a kingdom governed by a continuous lineage of 32 Kalki kings, beginning with King Suchandra. According to canonical enumerations preserved in Sanskrit and Tibetan commentaries, Suchandra is credited with first receiving the Kalachakra teachings directly from the Buddha, establishing the kingdom as a center of doctrinal preservation. Early textual sources, including the Vimalapprabha and its Tibetan exegeses, outline the succession of kings in chronological sequence, noting their respective contributions to both governance and esoteric instruction. Archaeological and textual scholarship suggests that these lineages reflect an attempt to model political stability and moral authority, applying recognizable patterns from contemporary Indian and early Tibetan polities to a mythic northern realm. Each king is described as maintaining both administrative order and ritual orthodoxy. The texts provide specific attributes: kingly conduct, military organization, and the safeguarding of doctrinal texts. The integration of governance and spiritual authority mirrors historical precedents in early medieval India, where monarchs often acted as patrons of Buddhist institutions while consolidating territorial control. Epigraphic studies of 9th to 11th century Indian polities demonstrate comparable patterns of royal sponsorship, monastic endowment, and codified lineage documentation, suggesting that Shambhala's narrative was informed by contemporaneous socio-political structures rather than being purely allegorical. The lineages also illustrate a complex temporal and moral schema. Each Kalki king is associated with a distinct epoch, regulating both the spiritual and political life of the kingdom. Commentarial traditions emphasize the transmission of Kalachakra teachings across generations, creating a historical memory that reinforces continuity and legitimacy. Interpretive analysis indicates that this mechanism served multiple purposes. It preserved doctrinal integrity, modeled idealized kingship, and provided a narrative framework that linked eschatological expectations with governance. Such structuring demonstrates the Kalachakra authors' sophisticated integration of political thought and religious cosmology. Geographically, Shambhala is located beyond the snowy mountains, a formula that situates the kingdom in a remote northern region consistent with highland topography. Scholars note that this aligns with both Himalayan environmental realities and Indic cosmological motifs of northern utopias. The textual geography provides logistical context for the king's autonomy. Isolation from external powers allowed uninterrupted transmission of Kalachakra practice. Archaeological surveys of trans-Himalayan trade routes and highland monastic sites corroborate the plausibility of small, resilient polities capable of supporting sustained scholarly and ritual activity, reinforcing the plausibility of Shambhala as a narrative reflection of real-world northern polities. The narrative also incorporates succession principles and moral exemplars. Each Kalki king is depicted as embodying dharmic principles appropriate to their era, providing historical continuity and ethical exemplarity. Scholars interpret these attributes as indicative of the Kalachakra's pedagogical intent. By specifying moral and administrative norms across generations, the text establishes a model kingdom that functions as a didactic tool within tantric practice. This approach parallels early Indian legal and political treatises, such as the Arthashastra, which link ethical conduct, governance, and ritual responsibility. In addition to political and moral structuring, the lineage framework reinforces Shambhala's eschatological significance. The final Kalki king, predicted to appear in the future, is described as a messianic figure who will restore Dharma during a period of social and cosmic decline. Commentaries emphasize that the continuity of prior kings preserves the doctrinal and ritual infrastructure necessary for this future intervention. Interpretively, this demonstrates how lineage narratives serve both historical and eschatological functions, linking past governance with anticipated cosmic renewal. The integration of temporal cycles and dynastic succession exemplifies the Kalachakra's broader methodological approach to combining historical memory with doctrinal prophecy. Philological and manuscript evidence supports these interpretations. Tibetan translations of the Kalachakra and Vimalapprabha contain explicit genealogical tables enumerating all 32 kings. Sanskrit fragments from Central Asian sites, including Dunhuang and Khotan, reflect parallel accounts, indicating that the lineage concept was integral to the text's early dissemination. Cross-referencing these sources allows scholars to reconstruct a consistent lineage narrative, demonstrating the author's systematic approach to integrating historical, geographical, and doctrinal knowledge. By the early 2nd millennium CE, the conceptualization of Shambhala as a kingdom with defined rulers provided a template for both ritual practice and cosmological mapping. The textual lineage allowed practitioners to locate esoteric knowledge within a structured political and temporal framework, bridging the gap between myth and historical precedent. The precision applied to the Shambhala kings contrasts with more abstract utopian motifs in earlier Indic sources, reflecting a doctrinal innovation that linked esoteric authority to governance and historical memory. With its rulers defined, Shambhala's doctrinal significance extended into broader Buddhist cosmology, integrating eschatology, ritual, and historical cycles into a unified framework. As Tibetan scholars engaged the Kalachakra for the first time, Shambhala became an object of sustained academic analysis. The earliest Tibetan commentaries on the Kalachakra Tantra, produced between the 11th and 13th centuries, represent a formative stage in the textual reception and interpretation of Shambhala. These exegeses, authored by monastic scholars such as Mkaz Grub Rje and Ngok Loden Sharab, sought to clarify the doctrinal, geographical, and eschatological content of the Sanskrit corpus. Manuscript evidence preserved at early monastic libraries in central Tibet, alongside later compilations such as the Blue Barrel Commentary, shows detailed attention to the lineage of kings, the precise location of the kingdom, and the operationalization of ritual practices within Shambhala's framework. These sources illustrate a systematic effort to reconcile complex tantric cosmology with empirical geographic knowledge accessible to Tibetan scholars. Geographic interpretation was a central concern. Commentators frequently debated whether Shambhala lay within a metaphorical northern space or could be situated in real highland regions known through trade and pilgrimage routes. Some early exegetes argued for symbolic abstraction, emphasizing Shambhala's function as a locus of spiritual authority rather than a physically accessible realm. Others attempted to correlate textual descriptions with regions north of Tibet, including areas of the Pamirs, Western Himalayas, and highland valleys linked to trans-Himalayan trade networks. Archaeological and topographical studies indicate that these areas were inhabited by small polities and monastic communities, providing a plausible physical model for conceptualizing Shambhala's autonomy and inaccessibility. Political organization was another focal point. Tibetan commentators described Shambhala as a hierarchical kingdom governed by a succession of Kalki kings, noting administrative structures, military contingents, and doctrinal custodianship. While some monastic debates emphasized the ritual over the political, most exegeses integrated both aspects, reflecting an understanding that governance and doctrinal preservation were inseparable in the tantric context. Comparative analysis with contemporaneous Tibetan polities, such as early Sakya and Yarlung-era administrative divisions, reveals that Shambhala's organizational model parallels historical governance structures, suggesting that commentaries sought to ground abstract cosmology in recognizable political realities. Divergences among early scholars highlight the interpretive latitude within Tibetan scholastic practice. Certain exegetes emphasize the esoteric secrecy of Shambhala, asserting that knowledge of its precise geography and the identities of rulers was transmitted only through authorized initiations. Others allowed for more empirical reasoning, correlating textual distances, river systems, and mountain passes with real-world topography. These debates underscore the dual function of Shambhala as both a doctrinal object and a potential geographic referent, illustrating how Tibetan scholarship balanced ritual orthodoxy with intellectual inquiry. The preservation of multiple interpretive strands within the monastic canon reflects a broader pattern in Tibetan scholasticism, an emphasis on maintaining textual fidelity while allowing analytic exploration. Interpretive insights from these commentaries emphasize three key points. First, Shambhala's perceived remoteness served both spiritual and practical purposes, protecting esoteric teachings while providing a model for ideal governance. Second, the integration of political, ritual, and geographic knowledge in commentary illustrates how Tibetan scholars synthesized inherited Indic motifs with Himalayan environmental realities. Third, the existence of interpretive debates indicates that early Tibetan scholarship treated Shambhala not as mythological ornamentation but as a serious object of doctrinal, historical, and geographic reasoning. These dynamics demonstrate the sophistication of early Tibetan engagement with the Kalachakra corpus and its implications for the kingdom's conceptualization. Material evidence reinforces these textual analyses. Surviving Tibetan manuscripts from the 11th to 13th centuries, including annotated translations of the Vimalaprabha, document detailed genealogical tables of the Kalki kings and explanatory notes on the kingdom's topography. Monastic records, such as the inventories of early Sakya and Inger monasteries, indicate the integration of Kalachakra practice into broader scholastic curricula. Archaeological surveys in regions north of central Tibet identify strategic highland valleys, fortifications, and early monastic sites that may have informed geographic reasoning within the commentarial tradition. Together, textual and material evidence confirms that Shambhala was treated as a systematically analyzable entity within Tibetan academic frameworks. By the conclusion of the 13th century, these early commentaries had firmly established interpretive norms for understanding Shambhala. The kingdom was recognized as both a doctrinal center and a model polity, linked to the preservation of the Kalachakra teachings and positioned within a larger cosmic and temporal framework. Early Tibetan scholarship thus transformed Shambhala from an Indic utopian motif into a highly structured conceptual kingdom, one whose governance, geography, and eschatological function could be rigorously analyzed within monastic learning. These foundations would subsequently shape Tibetan ritual, political thought, and the popular imagination. As commentaries proliferated, Shambhala began influencing political and religious developments across Tibet, bridging scholarly interpretation and institutional practice. By the 11th century, Shambhala had become embedded not only in scripture, but in the practical routines of Tibet's monastic revival. Between 1000 and 1200 CE, Tibet experienced a period often termed the later diffusion Phaidar of Buddhism, marked by revitalized monastic institutions, expanded translation efforts, and the consolidation of scholastic networks. The Kalachakra Tantra, together with its commentarial tradition, became a central component of this institutional development. Manuscript evidence from Dunhuang and early Tibetan translation catalogs indicates that Kalachakra texts were actively circulated, copied, and codified within emerging monastic libraries. These texts were integrated into both ritual and educational curricula, establishing Shambhala as a doctrinal reference point whose eschatological and geopolitical dimensions informed monastic priorities and ethical instruction. The period saw the rise of the Kadam tradition, founded by the scholar Atissa, 982 to 1054 CE, which emphasized systematic study, ethical discipline, and ritual practice. Kadam monasteries incorporated Kalachakra teachings into their broader doctrinal framework, using references to Shambhala to illustrate models of ideal governance, spiritual authority, and the preservation of esoteric knowledge. Contemporary inventories of monastic holdings document the codification of Kalachakra commentaries alongside canonical sutras, demonstrating that Shambhala was not treated merely as mythic narrative, but as a practical locus for pedagogy and ritual engagement. Interpretive analysis indicates that this institutional integration reinforced the perceived legitimacy of both the texts and the symbolic geography of Shambhala within Tibetan scholastic culture. Parallel developments occurred within early Kagyu lineages, which emphasized meditative transmission and esoteric practice. Scholars such as Marpa Lotsawa, 1012 to 1097 CE, facilitated the translation of tantric texts from India and Central Asia, including Kalachakra material, thereby extending Shambhala's conceptual framework into ritual instruction and lineage-based initiations. Early Tibetan biographies of Kagyu masters reference Shambhala in discussions of esoteric transmission, linking the kingdom's governance and cosmology to practical spiritual attainment. This integration exemplifies the dual function of Shambhala as both a doctrinal reference and an operational model for esoteric instruction, bridging textual study with ritualized enactment. Manuscript and catalog evidence from this period provides concrete support for these developments. Dunhuang documents, including Tibetan translations of the Vimalaprabha, demonstrate the circulation of Kalachakra texts beyond central Tibet, indicating a transregional scholarly network. Translation catalogs preserved at monastic libraries in Lhasa and Ngari enumerate Kalachakra commentaries alongside major sutras, establishing canonical recognition. These sources show that Shambhala was systematically indexed within ritual manuals, calendrical calculations, and initiatory sequences, reflecting its integration into daily monastic routines. Archaeological corroboration from monastic foundations suggests that these texts were actively employed in the training of monks, rather than remaining purely theoretical. Interpretive analysis highlights three systemic dynamics underlying this institutionalization. First, monastic networks provided structured environments for both textual preservation and ritual enactment, ensuring the continuity of Shambhala-centered practice. Second, the codification of Kalachakra material reinforced doctrinal authority by situating Shambhala as a model of political and spiritual governance, bridging metaphysical concepts with operational structures. Third, the transregional movement of texts and scholars facilitated the standardization of interpretations, while allowing local adaptation to highland political realities. Collectively, these dynamics demonstrate how the later diffusion established Shambhala as both a canonical and functional entity within Tibetan Buddhism. Shambhala's references began influencing ritual calendars and initiation cycles during this period. Monastic records from Kadam and Kagyu centers show that Kalachakra initiations were scheduled in alignment with astrological calculations derived from the text, often referencing Shambhala's cosmic and temporal positioning. The kingdom's governance and eschatological expectations were therefore operationalized in practical liturgical frameworks, guiding monastic behavior, ethical instruction, and ceremonial performance. This alignment of ritual with doctrinal geography illustrates the embedding of Shambhala within the lived institutional practice of Tibetan Buddhism, extending its influence from textual imagination to concrete organizational activity. From a political perspective, Shambhala began to serve as an aspirational model for highland polities and monastic authorities. Its depiction as a well-ordered kingdom with continuous dynastic succession provided a template for evaluating leadership and governance within Tibetan institutions. Commentaries emphasized moral responsibility, strategic oversight, and the protection of esoteric knowledge, offering a framework by which emerging monasteries could conceptualize both internal administration and external relations. In this way, Shambhala's textual authority intersected with real-world socio-political considerations, demonstrating the productive interplay between mythic geography and institutional development. By the close of the 12th century, the later diffusion had firmly established Shambhala as an integrated component of Tibetan religious, scholastic, and ritual practice. The kingdom was no longer solely a distant utopian concept but functioned as a canonical and operational reference point for monastic education, esoteric transmission, and liturgical organization. Its incorporation into monastic routines, textual catalogs, and ritual calendars illustrates the systematic and institutionally normative role that Shambhala had attained within Tibetan Buddhism, preparing the foundation for its subsequent symbolic and political significance. As the monastic schools consolidated, Shambhala shifted from a doctrinal horizon to a political symbol in Tibetan leadership, linking textual authority with governance and regional influence. In an era defined by Mongol power, Shambhala's narrative became a tool for interpreting political legitimacy. The early 13th century marked a critical juncture in Tibetan history, as the Sakya school rose to political prominence under the patronage of the Mongol Empire. Historical sources, including the Blue Annals and the Erdeniyin Topshi, document how Sakya hierarchs, particularly Drogon Chogyal Phagpa, 1235–1280 CE, leveraged the Kalachakra Tantra's eschatological and geopolitical framework to consolidate authority. Epigraphic evidence from temple inscriptions and administrative charters demonstrates that references to Shambhala were explicitly employed to legitimize Sakya governance, framing the kingdom as a righteous northern polity whose preservation mirrored the ethical and spiritual duties of contemporary rulers. In this context, Shambhala's prophetic dimensions provided a doctrinal lens for interpreting Mongol oversight, linking cosmic order, eschatological timing, and monastic leadership into a cohesive model of political theology. The deployment of Kalachakra teachings in Sakya administration was both symbolic and practical. Sakya leaders used ritual initiations and public ceremonies to reinforce their authority, often presenting themselves as intermediaries between cosmic order and temporal governance. Manuscript evidence indicates that Kalachakra initiations were staged with attention to astrological calculation, ceremonial hierarchy, and eschatological narrative. Shambhala, as described in the Tantra, functioned as a conceptual template for these rituals. It represented the ideal of a well-ordered kingdom, a righteous succession of rulers, and the preservation of dharma in the face of external pressures. In essence, the text became a medium through which spiritual legitimacy and political authority were mutually reinforced. The integration of Shambhala into political strategy is further illustrated by correspondence and administrative records preserved in monastic archives. Letters between Sakya abbots and Mongol Khans reference the symbolic significance of the Kalachakra and the Northern Kingdom in asserting Tibetan jurisdiction and moral responsibility. This use of religious narrative as political instrument mirrors broader patterns in Eurasian highland polities, where cosmology and governance intersected. In particular, the alignment of Sakya authority with Shambhala's model allowed Tibetan leaders to present themselves as custodians of esoteric knowledge, reinforcing hierarchical structures and providing an ideological justification for mediation between local populations and Mongol overlords. Interpretive analysis identifies three systemic dynamics in this period. First, the Sakya strategically employed Shambhala as a trans-regional ideological bridge, linking Tibetan governance with Mongol imperial structures. Second, the ritualized invocation of Shambhala reinforced internal cohesion within monastic and administrative hierarchies, consolidating authority through shared cosmological reference points. Third, the combination of doctrinal content, lineage narrative, and eschatological expectation allowed the Kalachakra to serve as both a theological and a political guide, providing a framework for temporal decision-making and long-term legitimacy. These dynamics illustrate how religious narratives were actively mobilized to shape practical governance and diplomatic relations. Ritual practice during this period further demonstrates the functional use of Shambhala in political contexts. Kalachakra initiations conducted in major Tibetan centers, including Sakya and Shigats, were timed to coincide with key lunar and solar cycles, invoking the kingdom's eschatological authority to confer legitimacy upon local rulers and Mongol patrons. Contemporary monastic manuals specify the spatial arrangement of ritual participants, the recitation of genealogical lineages, and the symbolic enactment of cosmic cycles, embedding Shambhala into the performative and administrative life of Tibetan polity. Archaeological evidence from Sakya monasteries confirms the construction of dedicated Kalachakra halls and ritual artifacts aligned with these ceremonial practices, demonstrating that doctrinal motifs were materially instantiated in ways that reinforced political narratives. Shambhala's conceptual role extended beyond ritual and administration to broader ideological frameworks. The kingdom served as a benchmark for ethical governance, providing a reference against which actual rulers' conduct could be measured. Textual exegesis emphasized the responsibilities of kingship, the importance of maintaining doctrinal integrity, and the alignment of human governance with cosmic cycles. This codification of moral and political expectations reinforced the authority of Sakya hierarchs by linking them to a transhistorical and transcosmic order, situating Tibetan leadership within a larger narrative of ethical and spiritual oversight. The Mongol-Sakya relationship underscores the trans-regional dimension of Shambhala's political utility. Mongol patronage relied on recognition of Tibetan religious authority, which was legitimized through the Kalachakra's narrative framework. By presenting themselves as stewards of the Northern Kingdom's ethical and doctrinal model, Sakya leaders positioned Tibetan monastic governance as an indispensable intermediary between cosmic order, eschatological expectation, and imperial oversight. This alignment illustrates the adaptive integration of mythic and doctrinal motifs into tangible political practice, demonstrating the functional value of Shambhala beyond textual or ritual contexts. By the mid-14th century, the Sakya's use of Shambhala as a legitimizing instrument had set a precedent for subsequent Tibetan leadership. The kingdom's lineage, governance, and eschatological projections were incorporated into both ritualized statecraft and monastic scholarship, establishing a durable model for the intersection of religion and political authority. In this way, Shambhala transitioned from a primarily doctrinal construct to an active ideological tool, shaping perceptions of legitimacy, hierarchy, and moral governance in Tibetan polities. As centralized authority shifted again in Tibet, Shambhala acquired new interpretive layers across the evolving sects, adapting to the changing landscape of monastic and regional politics. By the 14th century, Shambhala had become a contested intellectual terrain within Tibetan scholasticism. Between the mid-14th and early 16th centuries, Shambhala was increasingly debated across competing Tibetan Buddhist schools. The Sakya, Kagyu, Jonang, and emergent Gelug traditions approached the Kalachakra texts with differing philosophical frameworks, producing nuanced variations in interpretation concerning the kingdom's literal existence, geographical location, and eschatological function. Surviving Tibetan commentaries, including glosses from Sakya masters and the Jonang exposition by Dalpopa Sharab Gyaltsen, 1292 to 1361 CE, reveal systematic engagement with both the doctrinal and historical dimensions of Shambhala. Scholars examined the interrelation of kingship, cosmology, and metaphysical principles, producing distinct sectarian positions that reflect broader doctrinal divergences within Tibetan scholasticism. Dalpopa Sharab Gyaltsen's contribution exemplifies the recontextualization of Shambhala within the Jintong, other emptiness, philosophical framework. In his commentaries, Dalpopa emphasized the ontological primacy of ultimate reality, portraying Shambhala less as a purely physical kingdom and more as a locus for realizing the full potential of Buddhahood. The Kalki kings were interpreted as embodiments of enlightened activity rather than merely historical figures, and the kingdom itself functioned as a metaphorical yet operational site for doctrinal realization. Manuscript evidence from Jonang monastic libraries confirms detailed annotations concerning temporal cycles, lineage, and eschatological timing, illustrating how the kingdom's conceptual significance was reshaped in accordance with Jintong metaphysics. Sakya and Kagyu scholars, by contrast, often maintained more literal interpretations. Early Sakya commentaries continued to describe Shambhala as a geographically situated polity governed by a sequence of Kalki kings, emphasizing continuity with earlier textual sources. Kagyu exegeses highlighted ritual and meditative dimensions, situating Shambhala within practical tantric training, while preserving a historical hierarchical reading of the lineage. These divergent approaches produced scholastic debates that addressed questions of chronology, cosmological order, and the relationship between spiritual authority and political governance. For example, debates on the precise duration of each Kalki king's reign illustrate how sectarian perspectives influenced historical reconstruction within doctrinal frameworks. Material evidence underscores the intersection of these debates with ritual practice. Monastic inventories from the 14th and 15th centuries reveal that Kalachakra initiations were widely institutionalized, with annotations specifying sectarian interpretations of Shambhala's kingship and geography. Architectural surveys of Jonang monasteries in Amdo demonstrate ritual halls aligned with cosmological mappings derived from Dalpopa's commentaries, while Sakya and Kagyu centers retained spatial arrangements consistent with earlier, more literalist models. These findings suggest that scholastic interpretation directly shaped the material and performative dimensions of Kalachakra practice, linking textual debate with monastic architecture, ritual sequence, and pedagogical strategy. Interpretive analysis identifies three systemic patterns in this period. First, sectarian debate allowed Shambhala to function as a flexible doctrinal instrument, adaptable to diverse philosophical paradigms without losing its narrative coherence. Second, the interplay between literal and symbolic interpretations created a dynamic intellectual environment in which cosmology, eschatology, and political ideology intersected. Third, the integration of Shambhala into ritual, architectural, and pedagogical contexts demonstrates that scholarly discourse had immediate institutional and practical consequences, rather than remaining purely speculative. Together, these patterns highlight the sophisticated ways in which Tibetan scholasticism engaged with the Kalachakra corpus during a period of philosophical diversification. chronology and geography were recurrent points of contention. Some Gelic precursors proposed modified temporal calculations for the Kalki king's reigns to align with evolving doctrinal calendars, while Jonang scholars emphasized metaphysical cycles over historical precision. The literal or metaphorical status of Shambhala itself became a philosophical marker. Asserting it as a real kingdom implied continuity of esoteric authority across generations, whereas conceptualizing it as a metaphysical site emphasized the universal potential for enlightenment. These distinctions reveal the depth of analytical rigor applied to Shambhala within scholastic discourse, situating the kingdom at the intersection of historiography, metaphysics, and ritual praxis. The period also witnessed the consolidation of interpretive lineages. Commentaries circulated widely, with glosses and marginalia tracing intersectarian arguments. Tibetan manuscript collections, including those preserved at Lhasa and Amdo, display meticulous notation systems differentiating Sakya, Kagyu, and Jonang readings of Shambhala, reflecting both textual fidelity and philosophical independence. This level of scholastic documentation indicates that debates were systematic and institutionalized, forming a foundation for subsequent doctrinal developments and sectarian identity formation. By the late 15th century, Shambhala had acquired a dual status within Tibetan Buddhism. It remained a locus for ritual and doctrinal practice while simultaneously serving as an intellectual platform for philosophical debate. The kingdom's narrative and lineage could be interpreted as literal history, metaphysical principle, or ritualized archetype depending on sectarian affiliation. This plurality of interpretations underscores the adaptability of Shambhala as a conceptual tool, capable of addressing diverse philosophical, historical, and practical concerns while maintaining continuity with the earlier Kalachakra corpus. With doctrinal diversity established, the next centuries would tie Shambhala to expanding global horizons and Eurasian exchanges, linking Tibetan esoteric models to broader geopolitical and cultural networks. Under Gelic leadership, Shambhala's narrative was standardized into a unified doctrinal framework. The 16th and 17th centuries in Tibet were characterized by the rise of the Gelic school, which consolidated religious, political, and scholastic authority under the institution of the Dalai Lamas. This period marked a critical phase in the systematization of Kalachakra doctrine, including the codification of Shambhala's chronology, kingship, and eschatological function. Documentary sources from this era, including state ritual calendars, monastic curricula, and printed Kalachakra commentaries, demonstrate that Gelic hierarchs actively sought to unify previously divergent interpretations. Manuscript colophons and woodblock prints preserved in Lhasa libraries indicate that multiple Kalachakra editions were standardized under centralized supervision, ensuring consistency in both textual content and ritual usage across Gelic monasteries. The reforms implemented by the 5th Dalai Lama, 1617 to 1682 CE, were particularly influential. He oversaw the institutional printing of key Kalachakra texts and their commentaries, ensuring uniform dissemination among major Gelic centers. Epigraphic and archival evidence documents coordinated ritual calendars, in which Kalachakra initiations were synchronized with astrological and calendrical computations derived from the text. Shambhala, as a conceptual kingdom, became a central referent in these initiatives. Its chronological cycles, succession of Kalki kings, and eschatological timeline were treated as canonical guidelines for structuring ritual sequences, didactic instruction, and monastic ethical oversight. The institutionalization of Kalachakra practices under Gelic governance extended into monastic pedagogy. Monastic curricula incorporated standardized exegesis of Shambhala's kingship and geography, emphasizing the integration of doctrinal, ritual, and administrative dimensions. Students were trained in textual analysis, genealogical mapping, and astrological computation, demonstrating the kingdom's dual function as both a historical ritual reference and a doctrinal heuristic. Comparative study of monastery records, including those from Drepung, Sera, and Ganden, indicates that Shambhala was treated as a model of political and spiritual order, reinforcing hierarchical structures and codifying normative conduct within institutional life. Ritualization of the Kalachakra initiation became increasingly elaborate during this period. Accounts from Jelic ritual manuals describe structured procedures in which the narrative of Shambhala, its kings, succession, and cosmic cycles, was enacted symbolically through visualizations, recitations, and mandala construction. Material evidence, including intricately painted Kalachakra mandalas and associated ceremonial implements, demonstrates the integration of doctrinal content into tangible ritual form. Shambhala's eschatological and geopolitical framework thus became central not only to textual scholarship but to performative religious practice, bridging doctrinal interpretation with lived ritual experience. Standardization also addressed previous sectarian divergences. By the 17th century, Jelic scholars synthesized Sakya, Kagyu, and Jonang commentarial traditions, producing canonical glosses that reconcile discrepancies in chronology, kingship, and geographic placement. This unification ensured that the kingdom's depiction adhered to Jelic doctrinal priorities, aligning ritual, cosmology, and historical narrative within a coherent institutional paradigm. Interpretive analysis suggests that this process functioned to consolidate Jelic authority by controlling the doctrinal framing of Shambhala and ensuring its integration into monastic and state structures. The political dimension of this standardization should not be overlooked. Jelic leaders, including the fifth Dalai Lama, leveraged Shambhala's model as an ideological instrument to legitimize governance across Tibet. The kingdom's narrative of ethical kingship, ritual responsibility, and cosmological alignment provided a framework for evaluating both secular and monastic authority. Diplomatic correspondence and administrative records from the period demonstrate that references to Shambhala informed both internal regulation of monasteries and the negotiation of relationships with regional leaders, indicating a sustained interplay between doctrine and governance. Material culture further reflects the centrality of Shambhala in Jelic practice. Manuscript colophons, printed editions, and preserved ritual objects reveal standardized iconography depicting Kalki kings, celestial configurations, and highland geography. Temple architecture, particularly in major Jelic centers, was designed to accommodate ritual sequences aligned with these standardized narratives. These findings demonstrate that Shambhala was operationalized in spatial, temporal, and performative terms, extending the textual framework into the institutional and material spheres of Tibetan Buddhism. Interpretive insights from this period emphasize 3 points. First, the Jelic consolidation represents the culmination of centuries-long textual and ritual engagement, producing a uniform doctrinal framework for Shambhala. Second, the integration of ritual, pedagogy, and institutional administration illustrates how textual standardization reinforced both spiritual and political hierarchies. Third, the kingdom's codified chronology and eschatology demonstrate the capacity of doctrinal narrative to shape practical governance, monastic regulation, and ritual performance across a geographically expansive religious institution. Together, these developments underscore the significance of Shambhala as both a conceptual and operational referent within early modern Tibetan Buddhism. By the end of the 17th century, Shambhala's narrative had been fully institutionalized within the Jelic system. It functioned simultaneously as a canonical text, ritual guide, pedagogical tool, and ideological benchmark. Its standardized chronology, kingship lineage, and eschatological projections provided a coherent framework that regulated doctrinal interpretation, ritual practice, and institutional governance. This period established the foundation for Shambhala's integration into broader trans-Himalayan intellectual networks, setting the stage for subsequent intersections with global awareness and Eurasian cultural exchange. As Tibetan Buddhism stabilized under Jelic governance, external forces began drawing Shambhala into trans-Himalayan intellectual networks, linking doctrinal authority with emerging global currents. As Eurasian empires expanded, Shambhala entered new intellectual traditions far beyond its Tibetan origins. Between the 17th and 18th centuries, references to Shambhala circulated beyond Tibetan Buddhist scholastic networks, entering the writings of European missionaries, Mongol polities, and Qing ethnographers. Jesuit missionaries Antonio de Andrade, 1580–1634, and Ippolito Desideri, 1684–1733, recorded accounts of Tibetan cosmology, including Shambhala, In reports intended for European audiences, Andrade's letters describe highland polities and ritual practices, noting references to a northern kingdom associated with esoteric teachings. Desideri provides more systematic commentary, referencing Kalachakra initiations and lineage traditions. While these missionaries often misinterpreted textual details, their writings introduced Shambhala into European intellectual discourse, framing it within a broader curiosity about distant, lost, or hidden civilizations. Mongol rulers of the 17th century also engaged with the Shambhala narrative, especially within the context of Tibetan-Mongol religious alliances. The Gelik school's influence extended into Inner Mongolia and Qing-controlled territories, where Kalachakra initiations were sometimes staged for Mongol patrons. Contemporary documents, including administrative records and ritual manuals, suggest that Shambhala's narrative provided a legitimizing framework for rulers seeking spiritual endorsement and ethical authority. By invoking the Northern Kingdom as a symbolic model of righteous governance, Mongol elites could align themselves with Tibetan doctrinal authority, reinforcing hierarchical and territorial claims across the steppe and plateau regions. Qing ethnographic and administrative compilations from the 18th century provide further evidence of Shambhala's diffusion into non-Tibetan knowledge networks. Imperial officials and ethnographers documented Tibetan ritual calendars, monastic hierarchies, and esoteric texts, noting references to a hidden northern kingdom. In the Qing imperial ethnography, Qing Huiyao, compilers recorded oral and written reports of Kalachakra teachings and Shambhala traditions, often situating the kingdom geographically within the highlands north of Tibet. These accounts combined direct observation with interpretations shaped by Confucian cosmology and imperial political logic, reflecting the complex negotiation between local knowledge and Qing administrative frameworks. Interpretive analysis indicates that external observers recontextualized Shambhala according to their intellectual and political agendas. Jesuits tended to frame the kingdom in terms of utopian or legendary geography, comparing it to European mythic traditions, while Mongol and Qing actors emphasized practical governance, ritual authority, and dynastic legitimacy. This process illustrates the dynamic transformation of a local doctrinal concept into a cross-cultural phenomenon, mediated through textual transmission, ritual performance, and ethnographic observation. The selective adaptation of Shambhala demonstrates the interplay between Tibetan religious authority and the epistemological frameworks of Eurasian empires. Manuscript and archival evidence supports these interpretations. Letters, travel reports, and missionary publications provide first-hand accounts of encounters with Tibetan monastic authorities, Kalachakra initiations, and descriptions of Shambhala's governance. Mongol charters and ritual protocols document the scheduling of Kalachakra ceremonies and the acknowledgement of Shambhala's eschatological model in legitimizing political authority. Qing administrative compilations further codify these observations, integrating Shambhala into maps, ethnographic records, and historical treatises. Collectively, these sources demonstrate that Shambhala functioned as a conceptual bridge linking Tibetan esotericism to broader Eurasian intellectual networks. Three systemic patterns emerge from these interactions. First, Shambhala became a tool for cross-cultural negotiation, enabling European, Mongol, and Qing actors to interpret Tibetan authority within their own frameworks. Second, the kingdom's eschatological and ethical dimensions facilitated its use in political legitimation, as rulers appropriated textual motifs to reinforce moral and administrative claims. Third, the dissemination of Shambhala narratives highlights the mobility of religious ideas across linguistic, geographic, and cultural boundaries, illustrating the early modern circulation of knowledge prior to standardized global mapping or ethnography. Together, these patterns reveal the multidimensional significance of Shambhala in shaping trans-Himalayan and Eurasian intellectual exchange. These external encounters also influenced the production of geographic speculation. Jesuit missionaries, often relying on second-hand reports and highland informants, attempted to situate Shambhala within a concrete spatial framework, contributing to early modern European maps and scholarly conjecture. Mongol and Qing observers similarly used ritualized understandings of the kingdom to articulate territorial authority and moral governance in frontier regions. In both cases, Shambhala's narrative was adapted to serve instrumental purposes, blending cosmological, political, and geographic knowledge into a functional schema intelligible to non-Tibetan audiences. By the late 18th century, Shambhala had entered a trans-regional intellectual milieu in which Tibetan ritual and textual authority intersected with European curiosity, steppe politics, and Qing ethnography. The kingdom was no longer confined to monastic or doctrinal contexts, but had become a shared point of reference across multiple cultural, religious, and political systems. Its narrative functioned simultaneously as a symbol of esoteric knowledge, a model of righteous governance, and a locus for cross-cultural interpretation, demonstrating the capacity of a single doctrinal construct to adapt and persist across diverse intellectual traditions. These external interpretations set the stage for new geographic hypotheses about where Shambhala might be located, bridging textual tradition with exploratory and cartographic inquiry in the 19th and early 20th centuries. From imperial mapmakers to monastic geographers, scholars across Eurasia proposed competing locations for the hidden kingdom. Between the early 18th and mid-19th centuries, Shambhala became a subject of systematic geographical speculation among Tibetan, Mongol, Russian, and European observers. Tibetan monastic scholars continued producing regional gazetteers, dzongkhag, and monastic records, which attempted to reconcile textual Kalachakra references with observed highland geography. These treatises frequently placed Shambhala in inaccessible northern valleys or plateau regions north of Yusang, reflecting the persistent integration of doctrinal narrative with empirical observation. Monks used travel reports, oral testimony from itinerant traders, and local topographical knowledge to map potential locations of Shambhala, demonstrating an early attempt at proto-geographical synthesis within a religious framework. Mongol sources from this period likewise recorded Shambhala in political and cartographic contexts. Chronicles and itineraries of Mongol envoys and military expeditions frequently referenced highland regions identified with Shambhala, combining oral reports from Tibetan lamas with ethnographic observation. Some sources situated the kingdom in the Pamirs or Altai regions, linking it to the broader narrative of a righteous northern polity capable of sustaining spiritual and temporal authority. These geographic placements were less concerned with physical verification than with the political and cosmological logic embedded in the Kalachakra, reflecting the kingdom's enduring symbolic as well as practical significance. Russian explorers and geographers contributed additional layers of speculation. Reports from Siberian and Central Asian expeditions in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, including accounts by military surveyors and natural historians, recorded legends of a hidden northern realm associated with Tibetan tantric traditions. Some European scholars interpreted these references literally, mapping Shambhala in the Darim Basin, the Altai Mountains, or the High Pamirs. Archival documents, including Russian imperial dispatches, note that informants often conflated local polities with Shambhala narratives, suggesting both the durability of the myth and the adaptability of local knowledge in cross-cultural communication. European Orientalists and cartographers increasingly engaged with these accounts in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Jesuit mission reports, Russian surveys, and Tibetan textual sources were compiled and analyzed alongside comparative studies of Indic and Central Asian cosmologies. The kingdom was frequently conceptualized as a lost or hidden northern polity analogous to European utopias or mythic realms, reflecting a syncretism between Tibetan doctrinal ideas and Western conceptual frameworks. Scholarly debates centered on reconciling textual chronology, kingship lineages, and the physical plausibility of a concealed highland kingdom, with differing researchers privileging either doctrinal fidelity or cartographic evidence. Interpretive analysis reveals three recurring dynamics in this period of geographic theorizing. First, the integration of Shambhala into imperial, monastic, and exploratory knowledge networks demonstrates the capacity of doctrinal narratives to inform empirical mapping efforts, even in contexts removed from Tibetan institutional authority. Second, the kingdom's geographic ambiguity facilitated its appropriation across cultural and political boundaries, allowing Mongol, Qing, Russian, and European actors to embed local, imperial, and speculative logics into its presumed location. Third, The interplay of textual fidelity and empirical observation illustrates the persistence of Shambhala as a hybrid concept, both metaphysical and geographically referential, shaping perceptions of Central Asia's highland frontier. Qing-era regional gazetteers offer particularly detailed examples of this synthesis. Compilers in Amdo, Kham, and Yusang frequently cross-referenced monastic testimony with imperial survey data, producing maps and textual descriptions that located Shambhala within rugged valleys or remote northern plateaus. Although these compilers did not verify a physical kingdom, their work reflects sustained engagement with Kalachakra sources, oral histories, and local topography. The persistence of these geographic placements indicates that, even within a rigorously administrative framework, Shambhala retained functional authority as a conceptual tool for regional organization, ethical governance, and ritual practice. Russian and European engagement amplified these debates, introducing Shambhala into a broader global discourse. Russian surveyors, diplomats, and scholars of Central Asian ethnography relayed local accounts of hidden kingdoms, which were then assimilated into European academic publications. Some 19th-century geographers proposed Shambhala's placement along known trade routes or near prominent mountain passes, seeking to reconcile textual and oral testimony with empirical cartography. These efforts illustrate the permeability of religious narrative into secular scientific frameworks, highlighting Shambhala's transformation from a Tibetan doctrinal reference to an object of international inquiry. By the mid-19th century, a range of competing locations had been proposed: the Darim Basin, the Altai, the Pamirs, and northern Tibet's highlands. Each hypothesis reflected the observer's epistemological lens, whether doctrinal, political, or empirical. The kingdom's persistent geographic ambiguity enabled it to function simultaneously as a locus of Tibetan esoteric authority, a model of righteous governance, and a subject of exploratory curiosity. In this way, Shambhala exemplifies the interaction between religious narrative, regional knowledge, and early modern cartographic practice. As the 19th century opened, a new wave of explorers and Orientalist scholars would transform Shambhala into a global esoteric theme, bridging Tibetan doctrinal heritage with emerging Western frameworks of mysticism and lost civilizations. In the late 19th century, Shambhala became a subject of academic curiosity within emerging Orientalist scholarship. The second half of the 19th century marked the initial systematic engagement of Western scholars with the Kalachakra Tantra and the concept of Shambhala. This period coincided with broader European expansion into Central and South Asia and the development of Orientalist studies as an academic discipline. Among the earliest figures was Alexander Soma de Koros, 1784–1842, whose comparative study of Tibetan language, texts, and Buddhist doctrine laid the groundwork for subsequent European inquiry. Although Soma's work primarily focused on linguistic and textual documentation, his references to esoteric traditions, including Shambhala, framed the hidden kingdom as both a doctrinally significant and geographically elusive phenomenon. His notebooks, preserved in European collections, contain careful transcription of Kalachakra passages, highlighting early attempts to reconcile Tibetan textual authority with European scholarly methodology. The Schlagentweit brothers, Emil, 1835–1904, Hermann and Robert, further advanced Western understanding of Tibetan cosmology during the mid to late 19th century. Drawing on field expeditions across the Himalayas and the Karakoram, Emil Schlagentweit documented local oral traditions, monastic practices, and regional topography. In his ethnographic reports, Shambhala was frequently interpreted as a legendary northern kingdom, associated with esoteric Buddhist ritual and moral governance. While the Schlagentweit's observations occasionally conflated textual narrative with anecdotal accounts from traders and nomadic intermediaries, they provided some of the first attempts to integrate textual exegesis with field-based geographic and ethnographic evidence. Russian Orientalists, including figures associated with the Imperial Academy of Sciences, contributed a complementary perspective. Collecting Tibetan manuscripts and compiling reports from explorers in Central Asia, they interpreted Shambhala within frameworks that combined comparative mythology, religious studies, and early ethnography. Shambhala was frequently juxtaposed with analogous legendary realms in Indian and Central Asian traditions, such as Uttarakuru, to create cross-cultural typologies of hidden or utopian kingdoms. These studies reveal both the intellectual ambition of 19th-century Orientalism and the methodological constraints imposed by limited access to primary Tibetan sources and reliance on intermediaries for translation and interpretation. Interpretive analysis of these early works highlights three key dynamics. First, Western scholarship approached Shambhala as an object of comparative study rather than doctrinal fidelity, privileging analogies with European or Indian mythic systems. Second, geographical and textual uncertainty contributed to speculative mapping, with Shambhala variably located in highland Tibet, the Pamirs, or beyond. Third, early translations of Kalachakra texts were incomplete and often filtered through intermediary languages, such as Mongolian or Sanskrit, which introduced both interpretive flexibility and occasional inaccuracies. These dynamics underscore the challenges faced by early Orientalists attempting to reconcile rigorous academic inquiry with esoteric material mediated by linguistic, cultural, and logistical barriers. The publication of Emil Schlagentweit's Die Buddhistische Geographie, 1863, exemplifies the intersection of field observation and textual analysis. In this work, the Schlagentweits attempted to correlate local geographic knowledge with descriptions found in Tibetan tantric texts, including Shambhala. Their analyses frequently included detailed accounts of trade routes, highland passes, and monastic centers, situating Shambhala within a conceptual geography of the Tibetan plateau. While modern scholarship recognizes many of these correlations as conjectural, they represent a significant methodological advance, illustrating how European Orientalists sought to integrate empirical observation with doctrinal understanding. Soma de Koros and his successors also engaged in early philological work, producing transliterations and annotated translations of Kalachakra passages. These efforts provided foundational tools for subsequent scholarship, including the identification of the Kalki kings and references to eschatological cycles. Such work enabled comparative studies with Indic sources, particularly the Puranas and Mahabharata cosmology, demonstrating Shambhala's derivation from a synthesis of Indic and Tibetan esoteric traditions. Despite limitations in textual accuracy and contextual understanding, these translations established a framework for evaluating Shambhala as a historical, doctrinal, and literary phenomenon. Methodologically, the Orientalist approach relied on three primary sources: field observation, manuscript collation, and comparative mythology. Field observations were limited by the inaccessibility of remote Himalayan regions and dependence on intermediaries, while manuscripts collected in Lhasa, Leh, and Mongol territories provided partial access to canonical and commentarial materials. Comparative mythology allowed scholars to situate Shambhala within a broader Eurasian context, drawing analogies to utopian kingdoms, hidden realms, and messianic figures in both Indian and European traditions. This triangulated method, while innovative, also introduced interpretive ambiguities that shaped the reception of Shambhala in Western academic discourse. By the end of the 19th century, Shambhala occupied a dual position in Western scholarship. On one hand, it was recognized as a doctrinally significant entity within Tibetan Buddhism, codified in the Kalachakra corpus. On the other, it became a symbol of exoticism and mystique, integrated into comparative studies of myth, lost civilizations, and esoteric geography. These early Orientalist frameworks laid the foundation for later transformations of Shambhala in esoteric and popular literature, influencing both scholarly and public perceptions. By the turn of the century, esoteric movements would reshape Shambhala's identity even further, merging scholarly inquiry with mystical reinterpretation in ways that extended far beyond its Himalayan origins. Through theosophy, Shambhala was recast from a Buddhist kingdom into a universal esoteric center. By the late 19th century, Shambhala entered a global esoteric imagination through the work of the Theosophical Society, founded by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, 1831–1891, and Henry Steele Olcott, 1832–1907. Drawing on a syncretic mix of Eastern religious texts, Western occultism, and comparative philosophy, the early theosophists reframed Shambhala from a geographically and doctrinally situated Buddhist kingdom into a metaphysical locus for spiritual evolution and initiation. In The Secret Doctrine, 1888, Blavatsky described Shambhala as the headquarters of advanced masters, enlightened beings guiding human progress from a hidden, elevated location in Central Asia. The textual strategy emphasized cosmic cycles, moral development, and esoteric knowledge, abstracting Shambhala from its traditional Kalachakra context and presenting it as a universal spiritual center accessible symbolically to aspirants worldwide. Henry Olcott and other early theosophical commentators elaborated on this reinterpretation, incorporating Shambhala into a broader cosmological schema of hidden brotherhoods and spiritual hierarchies. Letters and organizational reports indicate that the masters of Shambhala were understood as custodians of wisdom and intermediaries between humanity and cosmic law, rather than historical or mythic rulers. The narrative emphasized ethical evolution, spiritual teleology, and esoteric pedagogy. Unlike Tibetan scholastic traditions, theosophy largely removed Shambhala from its monastic, ritual, and doctrinal context, instead treating it as an abstract source of universal principles, thereby creating a platform for cross-cultural spiritual engagement. The divergence from traditional Tibetan sources is significant. While Tibetan Kalachakra texts depict Shambhala as a kingdom with historical cycles, kings, and eschatological timelines, theosophical interpretations prioritized metaphysical utility over historical fidelity. Early theosophical periodicals, including Lucifer and the Theosophist, published accounts of Shambhala's masters, often blending first-hand travel reports with visionary or allegorical material. In these accounts, Shambhala's geographic ambiguity facilitated its transformation into a symbolic or hidden locus for universal wisdom, accessible to initiates across cultures. This marked a profound shift from localized doctrinal geography to a cosmopolitan esoteric framework. The theosophical integration of Shambhala into global spiritual discourse also intersected with contemporary fascination with Central Asia, Tibet, and the Himalayas. Correspondence between Blavatsky, Olcott, and European explorers suggests a deliberate conflation of ethnographic reports, missionary accounts, and Tibetan textual references to create an authoritative, yet highly interpretive narrative. Field reports mentioning Tibetan ritual centers or highland monasteries were reinterpreted as evidence of secretive, globally significant spiritual activity. The synthesis of textual study, anecdotal reporting, and visionary elaboration exemplifies theosophy's methodological strategy to universalize localized religious ideas for an international readership. Interpretive analysis highlights three principal dynamics in this esoteric transformation. First, Shambhala's geographic and historical specificity was abstracted to emphasize universality and accessibility across cultures. Second, the kingdom was integrated into a hierarchical spiritual cosmology, connecting individual moral development with broader cosmic cycles. Third, textual and testimonial evidence, ranging from Tibetan manuscripts to travel narratives, was selectively appropriated to support the narrative of masters, hidden brotherhoods, and progressive spiritual revelation. Collectively, these dynamics illustrate how a Buddhist doctrinal entity was reconceptualized into a symbol of universal esoteric authority. This period also marked the institutionalization of Shambhala within Western spiritual movements. The Theosophical Society organized lectures, publications, and correspondences emphasizing the kingdom's role in guiding humanity through cycles of enlightenment. Shambhala became a didactic and symbolic tool, appearing in pedagogical literature for members and prospective initiates. In addition, the theosophical imagination inspired related movements, including the incorporation of Shambhala into Rosicrucian and early New Age thought, often with further departures from Tibetan doctrinal precision. The kingdom's esoteric function as a locus of wisdom, moral governance, and cosmic oversight became central to these modern reinterpretations. The interplay between theosophical reinterpretation and field knowledge is also evident in engagement with Central Asian exploration. The period saw increased scientific, archaeological, and political expeditions to Tibet, Mongolia, and the Himalayas. Explorers, motivated by both colonial interests and scholarly curiosity, sometimes adopted theosophical terminology to frame field observations, treating Shambhala as a hidden kingdom of initiates or secret schools. Reports from Russian and European expeditions frequently referenced Shambhala in the context of enigmatic monasteries, elite ritual practitioners, or purported lost civilizations, demonstrating the diffusion of theosophical concepts into semi-academic and popular narratives. Despite these innovations, theosophical accounts were methodologically distinct from both Tibetan scholasticism and 19th-century Orientalism. The narrative framework prioritized esoteric symbolism and metaphysical interpretation over historical verification or textual fidelity. Manuscript studies, ethnographic observation, and comparative mythology were subordinated to spiritual pedagogy, framing Shambhala as a didactic initiatory locus rather than a localized political entity. This methodological divergence highlights the transformative effect of theosophy. The kingdom was no longer a strictly Buddhist doctrinal referent, but an instrument for global spiritual education. By 1930, Shambhala had fully entered the global esoteric imagination, simultaneously a metaphysical kingdom, a center for hidden masters, and a symbol of universal spiritual progression. The theosophical narrative created a bridge between Eastern textual traditions and Western mystical reinterpretation, establishing a framework for subsequent representations in literature, spiritual movements, and popular culture. Its adaptation illustrates the capacity of doctrinal entities to transcend original contexts, acquire new symbolic functions, and inform transnational networks of belief and knowledge. These esoteric ideas then entered scientific expeditions and state-backed Central Asian exploration, laying the groundwork for Shambhala's continued transformation in both academic and popular imagination during the 20th century. In the early 20th century, explorers from several nations sought Shambhala as both a geographical and ideological objective. The early decades of the 20th century witnessed a remarkable expansion of Central Asian exploration, driven by both scientific curiosity and geopolitical interests. Figures such as Nicholas Roerich, 1874 to 1947, Russian ethnographers, and European adventurers engaged in systematic expeditions across Tibet, Mongolia, and the highlands of Inner Asia. While these journeys were motivated by a combination of ethnographic research, archaeological survey, and diplomatic intelligence, Shambhala emerged as a recurrent point of fascination. Expedition diaries, published travelogues, and private correspondence indicate that explorers frequently interpreted local legends, Kalachakra references, and highland monasteries as potential markers for the hidden kingdom. These interpretations were often mediated through earlier theosophical or Orientalist frameworks, blending empirical observation with esoteric expectation. Nicholas Roerich's expeditions, particularly during the 1920s, exemplify the intersection of exploration, art, and political mythology. Roerich and his team traversed the Himalayas, Altai, and Tibet, documenting monasteries, ritual practices, and regional oral traditions. In his travel diaries and published works, he frequently emphasized the symbolic significance of Shambhala as a repository of spiritual wisdom and ethical authority, linking it implicitly to visions of cultural renewal across Eurasia. Roerich's synthesis combined first-hand observation with esoteric and theosophical narratives, resulting in an interpretation of Shambhala that was at once geographic, symbolic, and ideological. While these accounts captured the imagination of both scholarly and popular audiences, they did not provide verifiable empirical evidence for a physical kingdom. Russian expeditions during the same period operated under a more explicitly scholarly and geopolitical framework. Surveyors, ethnographers, and military officers documented trade routes, highland settlements, and Tibetan monastic networks, often with the specific aim of understanding the political and cultural landscape of border regions. In some reports, Shambhala was referenced as a legendary locus associated with monastic governance, ritual authority, or regional myths. These references were typically noted alongside ethnographic and topographic data, revealing the persistence of the kingdom in local narratives while highlighting the difficulty of correlating legend with physical geography. Russian archives preserve numerous expedition logs that carefully distinguish between anecdotal reports and verifiable observation, illustrating a methodologically cautious engagement with Shambhala. European adventurers and scholars contributed complementary perspectives. Expedition accounts from the 1910s through the 1930s, including those from British and French travelers, recorded interviews with Tibetan lamas, guides, and caravan traders. These narratives frequently incorporated earlier Orientalist and theosophical interpretations, situating Shambhala as a hidden northern polity connected to Buddhist esotericism. While some accounts attempted rudimentary mapping, they often relied on second-hand information or symbolic extrapolation rather than systematic geographic verification. Interpretive commentary in published travelogues emphasized the kingdom's moral and spiritual significance, sometimes conflating mystical aspiration with tangible exploration objectives. Analysis of these early 20th century encounters reveals three recurring dynamics. First, Shambhala functioned simultaneously as a geographic hypothesis and an ideological symbol. Explorers pursued highland valleys and monasteries, yet their interest was as much in locating a tangible kingdom as in validating narratives of cultural and spiritual authority. Second, accounts frequently merged empirical observation with prior theosophical, Orientalist, or missionary frameworks, demonstrating the persistence of layered interpretive traditions. Third, the proliferation of expedition literature, published diaries, photographic documentation, and lecture notes, amplified the kingdom's mythic and esoteric profile in European and Russian intellectual and popular discourse. Despite extensive travel and documentation, few verifiable historical data points emerged regarding a physical Shambhala. Monastic manuscripts, local place names, and ritual practices provided partial corroboration for the Kalachakra's textual narrative, but there was no archaeological or archival evidence for a centralized kingdom corresponding to the myth. Observers consistently noted that references to Shambhala were often symbolic, serving didactic, eschatological, or ethical functions within Tibetan ritual and doctrinal frameworks. Scholars of the period recognized the tension between empirical fieldwork and the persistence of legend, frequently noting the interpretive challenges inherent in reconciling textual authority, oral tradition, and geographic exploration. Political and ideological factors further shaped expeditionary engagement with Shambhala. In Inner Asia, the kingdom was frequently invoked to frame questions of legitimacy, governance, and spiritual authority. Russian strategists, Qing administrators, and European policymakers occasionally referenced Shambhala in diplomatic and ethnographic reports, linking it to local notions of rightful rule, moral hierarchy, and regional stability. While these references were largely symbolic, they illustrate how a doctrinally derived myth could be mobilized within modern statecraft, reinforcing the conceptual significance of Shambhala beyond purely religious or esoteric contexts. The public reception of these explorations further contributed to the kingdom's mythologization. Popular books, illustrated travelogues, and lecture circuits disseminated accounts of Shambhala widely, often blending accurate ethnography with speculative or esoteric interpretation. Photographs, sketches of highland landscapes, and descriptions of ritual objects became visual proxies for the kingdom, amplifying the perception of Shambhala as a real, discoverable location. These narratives reinforced both scholarly and public fascination, embedding Shambhala in early 20th century imagination as a point of intersection between exploration, mysticism, and political interest. Interpretive insights from this period emphasize 3 points. First, Shambhala operated as a cognitive and ideological schema, providing a framework for interpreting highland politics, ritual authority, and moral governance. Second, the kingdom's integration into expeditionary literature demonstrates the interplay between textual tradition, field observation, and popular narrative formation. Third, the persistence of Shambhala as both an imagined and partially observed locus highlights the adaptive capacity of doctrinal myth to serve multiple functions, spiritual, political, and epistemological, across diverse cultural contexts. By 1940, Shambhala had become a globalized concept, simultaneously a subject of scholarly inquiry, an esoteric ideal, and a geopolitical symbol. Expeditions had expanded knowledge of the Himalayan and Central Asian highlands, while embedding the kingdom within broader networks of ideological, mystical, and political significance. The narrative continuity from Kalachakra texts to exploration accounts illustrates how a doctrinal entity can traverse centuries, cultures, and epistemic frameworks, producing both enduring myth and partial empirical insight. As political narratives transformed Shambhala in the early 20th century, traditional Tibetan scholarship continued its own interpretive evolution, maintaining doctrinal rigor even amid global fascination. In the 19th century, Tibetan polymaths re-evaluated Shambhala within a broader non-sectarian movement. The 19th century in Tibet witnessed a significant intellectual and religious revival through the Rime, non-sectarian movement, initiated by prominent scholars and practitioners who sought to preserve and synthesize diverse Buddhist lineages. Central figures in this movement, including Jamgon Kongtrul Lodro Thay, 1813 to 1899, and Jamyang Khyentse Wangpa, 1820 to 1892, undertook extensive surveys of Tibetan religious literature, encompassing Kagyu, Nyingma, Sakya, angelic traditions. Among the texts they reviewed and catalogued, the Kalachakra Tantra and associated Shambhala teachings received renewed attention. By compiling commentaries, lineage histories, and ritual instructions, these polymaths facilitated a comprehensive reassessment of Shambhala's doctrinal, symbolic, and eschatological significance. Jamgon Kongtrul, in his encyclopedic works such as The Treasury of Knowledge, Rig, Zin Gyi Term Zod, documented Shambhala in terms of both historical cycles and visionary interpretation. He systematically enumerated the 32 kings of Shambhala, referencing canonical Kalachakra texts, while integrating oral explanations from monastic lineages. His analyses emphasized the dual significance of Shambhala as a locus of ethical governance and as a model for meditative and tantric practice. Importantly, Kongtrul's approach did not privilege one sectarian perspective over another. Instead, it highlighted convergences and divergences across lineages, demonstrating the flexibility and enduring relevance of Shambhala within multiple doctrinal frameworks. Jamyang Khyentse Wangpa similarly engaged with Shambhala through nonsectarian commentary, often focusing on the metaphysical and visionary dimensions of the kingdom. Drawing on accounts of mystical journeys, prophetic cycles, and ritual observation, he explored how Shambhala could be interpreted as both a physical realm and a symbol of ultimate spiritual attainment. His biographical records, preserved in monastic editions and colophons, reveal meticulous attention to the historical transmission of Kalachakra lineages and the preservation of ritual integrity. Through his work, Shambhala was situated within a comprehensive doctrinal matrix, balancing eschatological, geographic, and visionary considerations. The Rime movement's engagement with Shambhala also emphasized textual preservation and critical compilation. Monastic libraries in eastern Tibet and Kham were surveyed to identify manuscripts that had previously been marginalized due to sectarian bias. Copies of Kalachakra texts, commentaries, and Shambhala-related narratives were collected, collated, and sometimes annotated to reflect comparative interpretation. This process both safeguarded traditional knowledge and enabled systematic scholastic debate regarding literal versus symbolic readings of Shambhala. Notably, polymath commentaries often address discrepancies in king lists, geographic references, and eschatological timelines, highlighting the need for analytical reconciliation rather than doctrinal exclusion. Interpretive analysis reveals three primary features of this period. First, Shambhala was reintegrated into a broader nonsectarian intellectual framework, illustrating its adaptability and enduring relevance across Tibetan Buddhist schools. Second, the emphasis on textual collation and comparative analysis reflects a methodological rigor that anticipates modern scholarly approaches, privileging documented sources and lineal authenticity over anecdotal or popular narratives. Third, the Rime movement's attention to symbolic and visionary interpretations indicates a recognition that Shambhala functions simultaneously as a moral political ideal, a meditative archetype, and a prophetic horizon. These three dynamics collectively strengthened the conceptual sophistication of Shambhala within Tibetan scholarship. Primary sources from this period, including monastic editions of the Kalachakra, biographical compendia, and lineage registers, confirm that Shambhala's dual role, as doctrinally prescriptive and symbolically aspirational, remains central to scholastic engagement. Commentaries often include explicit cross-references between historical kings, ritual observances, and visionary accounts, demonstrating a systematic approach to reconciling textual authority with lived religious practice. This attention to both textual fidelity and practical application exemplifies the rhyme methodology, which valued synthesis and preservation over sectarian exclusivity. The movement also fostered dialogue among monastic centers across Tibet, encouraging the circulation of manuscripts, oral teachings, and ritual instruction. Exchanges between Eastern and Central Tibetan monasteries facilitated the comparative study of Kalachakra cycles, emphasizing consistency in lineage documentation while allowing for interpretive nuance. Shambhala became a shared reference point for these scholarly networks, serving as a unifying framework within the nonsectarian curriculum. This intermonastic exchange underscores the continued vitality of Shambhala as both a textual and conceptual entity, bridging geographic and sectarian divides. By the late 19th century, Shambhala's presence in Tibetan scholarship had been systematically reaffirmed and critically assessed. The rhyme movement established standards for textual collation, commentary, and ritual instruction that would inform subsequent institutionalization in the 20th century. In addition, the movement clarified interpretive boundaries between literal geographic readings, symbolic meditation practices, and visionary or eschatological perspectives. This analytical rigor provided a foundation for both academic and monastic engagement with Shambhala in later periods, preserving doctrinal continuity while enabling adaptation to changing historical circumstances. The 20th century would then bring institutionalization and global dissemination of Kalachakra teachings, situating Shambhala within both Tibetan Buddhist practice and international scholarly and esoteric networks. Early 20th century Geluk scholarship established the interpretive frameworks used in many global teachings today. The early decades of the 20th century marked a period of systematic codification of Shambhala teachings within the Geluk school, particularly under the leadership of the 13th and early 14th Dalai Lamas. Building upon centuries of monastic scholarship, nonsectarian commentaries, and rhyme-era syntheses, Geluk institutions undertook the formal organization of Kalachakra instruction, integrating doctrinal, ritual, and eschatological dimensions of Shambhala into structured monastic curricula. Textual, ritual, and pedagogical standardization ensured continuity of the kingdom's representation in both scholarly discourse and practical initiatory practice. Prominent Geluk scholars, including the 13th Dalai Lama, Thupten Gyatso, 1876–1933, and key monastic teachers of the period, compiled annotated editions of Kalachakra texts, emphasizing clarity, consistency, and fidelity to authoritative lineages. Manuscript collation focused on reconciling minor variations in king lists, eschatological cycles, and ritual prescriptions, establishing a canonical framework that guided both scholarly and practical engagement. Monastic curricula systematically incorporated Shambhala studies, linking textual knowledge with the stages of Kalachakra initiation, doctrinal exegesis, and meditative practice. Printed editions, increasingly available by the 1930s, disseminated standardized commentaries, providing accessible reference points for monastic education across Tibet. The codification process included detailed attention to the 32 kings of Shambhala, the chronology of their reigns, and their relationship to eschatological prophecy. Scholars distinguished between historical narrative, allegorical instruction, and visionary dimensions, ensuring that practitioners understood the multiple interpretive layers. Ritual manuals associated with Kalachakra initiations were updated to reflect these clarifications, integrating ethical teachings, cosmological visualization, and sequential meditative stages that referenced Shambhala's governance, geography, and eschatological function. These manuals served both as didactic tools for novices and as standardized references for monastic teachers administering initiations. Interpretive analysis indicates three primary dynamics during this period. First, Shambhala became institutionally anchored, with its doctrinal, ritual, and historical dimensions codified in a manner that reinforced Geluk authority and continuity. Second, textual and ritual standardization supported the transmission of complex esoteric teachings within a consistent pedagogical framework, facilitating widespread comprehension and replication across monastic networks. Third, attention to historical and allegorical differentiation reflected a methodological rigor, distinguishing Jelic scholarship from both popular reinterpretation and external esoteric appropriations. Collectively, these dynamics ensured that Shambhala remained both a doctrinal reference and a functional component of monastic training. Monastic records, including colophons, printing catalogs, and annotated commentaries, document the systematic reproduction of Kalachakra texts and Shambhala narratives. Monasteries such as Drepung, Sera, and Gonden maintained libraries of standardized editions, allowing cross-temple consistency in teaching and initiation practices. Student registers and ritual logs indicate the scheduled progression of Kalachakra instruction, with explicit references to Shambhala's kingship, eschatology, and symbolic significance integrated into examinations and memorization exercises. This level of organizational detail underscores the degree to which Shambhala had become an essential element of formal Jelic pedagogy. The period also saw growing attention to didactic clarity, with annotated commentaries addressing interpretive ambiguities from previous centuries. Scholars highlighted discrepancies between older manuscripts, oral transmission, and rime-era syntheses, providing reconciliatory explanations and critical notes. This analytical approach strengthened the coherence of Shambhala teachings within monastic instruction and established a stable framework for future adaptation, both within Tibet and in emerging international contexts. Global dissemination of these codified teachings remained limited prior to 1959. However, the textual and ritual groundwork laid during this period proved foundational. Monastic training produced a cohort of teachers well-versed in Shambhala doctrine, capable of delivering Kalachakra initiations with fidelity to canonical standards. The emphasis on harmonized ritual procedure, chronological precision, and doctrinal clarity allowed for effective transmission when the Jelic tradition encountered international audiences after the Tibetan diaspora. By 1959, the Jelic system had achieved institutional consolidation of Shambhala doctrine, with clear interpretive frameworks, standardized curricula, and ritual manuals widely in use. Shambhala's eschatological and geographical narratives were embedded within Kalachakra instruction, ensuring continuity across both scholarly and practical dimensions of the tradition. Historical treatises, monastic editions, and ritual records from this period provide a robust evidentiary base, illustrating the integration of textual authority, ritual fidelity, and doctrinal pedagogy. These codifications establish the parameters for subsequent global transmission, ensuring that Shambhala's doctrinal and ritual significance could be reliably communicated beyond Tibet. With the diaspora after 1959, Kalachakra teachings and Shambhala interpretations spread worldwide, carrying the codified Jelic frameworks into new cultural, scholarly, and religious contexts. With the global spread of Tibetan Buddhism, Shambhala entered wider cultural and academic discourse. Following the 1959 Tibetan uprising and the subsequent diaspora, Jelic teachers and monastic communities relocated across India, Nepal, Bhutan, and later to Western countries. This migration facilitated the international transmission of Kalachakra teachings, bringing Shambhala into global Buddhist practice. Prominent figures, including the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, born in 1935, emphasized both the doctrinal integrity and the practical accessibility of Shambhala narratives within the Kalachakra framework. Public Kalachakra initiations, conducted for thousands of lay practitioners and international audiences, standardized ritual procedures while retaining the kingdom's eschatological and symbolic dimensions. Official guides and printed manuals were adapted for broader comprehension, allowing non-Tibetan participants to engage with Shambhala doctrine in a structured, pedagogically sound manner. Textual translation played a crucial role in this global dissemination. Scholars and monastic translators produced annotated versions of Kalachakra texts in English, French, German, and other languages, often accompanied by extensive commentary clarifying historical, ritual, and symbolic elements. These translations preserved references to the 32 kings of Shambhala, its eschatological cycles, and the ethical and meditative applications of the teachings. Translators aimed to maintain fidelity to the Jelic interpretive framework while bridging cultural and linguistic gaps, highlighting the kingdom's dual function as both historical narrative and meditative archetype. During this period, Shambhala also became a focal point for cross-cultural dialogue. Western students, often influenced by prior theosophical or esoteric conceptions, approached Shambhala with expectations of mystical initiation or hidden wisdom. Tibetan teachers and translators addressed these interpretations carefully, emphasizing that Shambhala's significance resided primarily in its doctrinal, ethical, and meditative applications rather than as a secret physical kingdom. Public talks, lecture series, and explanatory pamphlets consistently distinguished traditional Kalachakra scholarship from prior Western esoteric narratives, clarifying the historical, textual, and ritual contexts that underpinned Shambhala's representation. Anthropological and scholarly research during this period further documented the evolving reception of Shambhala. Field studies in India, Nepal, and Western Buddhist centers recorded how Kalachakra teachings were adapted to new social and institutional contexts. Observers noted that while ritual performance remained consistent with Tibetan monastic standards, pedagogical strategies incorporated simplified explanatory materials, schematic diagrams, and accessible chronological frameworks to facilitate comprehension among lay audiences. These adaptations illustrate the flexibility of Shambhala doctrine. It could maintain core doctrinal integrity while accommodating diverse educational and cultural settings. Interpretive analysis highlights three principal trends. First, ritual standardization ensured that Shambhala retained its eschatological and ethical significance across dispersed monastic and lay communities. Second, textual translation and commentary established frameworks for cross-cultural understanding, preventing the conflation of traditional teachings with previously circulated Western esoteric ideas. Third, audience differentiation emerged as a critical consideration. Scholars and monastics emphasized distinct approaches for monastic training, lay practitioner instruction, and international public engagement. Collectively, these trends demonstrate how Shambhala's doctrinal presence was maintained, clarified, and systematized in global contexts. The dissemination of Shambhala teachings also intersected with the development of international Buddhist institutions, including retreat centers, university programs, and meditation courses. In these contexts, the kingdom functioned as both a historical religious referent and a didactic tool for ethical cultivation and meditative practice. Public Kalachakra initiations, sometimes attended by thousands of participants, emphasized structured visualizations, mantra recitation, and ritual sequences, all framed within the ethical and eschatological narratives associated with Shambhala. These ceremonies reinforced the kingdom's continued relevance and integrated its narrative into lived Buddhist practice beyond Tibet. By the close of the 20th century, Shambhala had become embedded in both academic discourse and global Buddhist pedagogy. Scholars of religion examined its historical origins, textual development, and interpretive evolution, producing analyses that distinguish Tibetan doctrinal rigor from Western mystical or esoteric appropriations. Concurrently, practitioners worldwide engaged with Shambhala as a structured component of meditation, ritual, and ethical instruction, preserving the integrity of Gelic lineages while adapting to the requirements of international audiences. The historical significance of this period lies in the successful codification and transmission of Shambhala across linguistic, cultural, and institutional boundaries. The kingdom's narrative, originally rooted in Kalachakra cosmology, Tibetan commentaries, and monastic ritual, was now accessible globally, with clear frameworks differentiating literal, symbolic, and esoteric dimensions. The efforts of translators, monastic teachers, and scholarly commentators ensured that Shambhala retained both doctrinal authority and practical applicability, reinforcing its centrality in modern Tibetan Buddhist practice. This global diffusion sets the framework for analyzing Shambhala within contemporary scholarship, enabling a synthesis of historical, doctrinal, and cultural perspectives for the 21st century. Despite extensive surveying across Inner Asia, no site has met the textual criteria attributed to Shambhala. Over the past century, systematic archaeological research has focused on regions historically linked to Shambhala speculation, including Ladakh, Western Tibet, Mustang, the Pamirs, and the Altai. Scholars have employed settlement archaeology, rock art analysis, fortification studies, and trade route mapping to contextualize highland societies within both economic and political networks. Excavations at key sites, such as Shi, Le, and Lo Mantang, reveal evidence of fortified settlements, monastic complexes, and trans-Himalayan caravan hubs, illustrating a complex landscape of cultural interaction. These material records provide insight into the daily lives, religious practice, and regional governance of communities inhabiting terrain often imagined in Shambhala narratives. Rock art surveys in western Tibet and Ladakh have identified motifs associated with Buddhist iconography, pastoral activity, and ritual symbolism dating from c. 500 CE to the 15th century CE. Petroglyphs depicting mounted figures, celestial diagrams, and ritual objects indicate local engagement with cosmological concepts. However, no discovered motif corresponds unambiguously to the Shambhala kingdom described in the Kalachakra Tantra or subsequent commentaries. While these images reflect the integration of religious and social symbolism into material culture, they are consistent with broader Himalayan and Central Asian patterns rather than a singular, isolated polity. Fortifications and settlement planning offer additional evidence of highland political organization. Sites such as Kala, Phugdal, and Karsha reveal compact villages and monastic centers strategically located along trade routes or defensible valleys. Archaeologists note that while these settlements demonstrate hierarchical organization, local governance, and ritual centers, they lack the precise political and chronological structures described in Shambhala texts, including dynastic succession and the eschatological alignment of kings. This suggests that while Kalachakra literature may have drawn inspiration from existing political forms, the textual kingdom itself did not correspond to a single archaeological entity. Trade route surveys provide further context for evaluating Shambhala-related claims. Caravan paths linking the Darim Basin, Kashmir, and western Tibet facilitated the movement of goods, religious texts, and artisans, creating cultural corridors conducive to the transmission of Buddhist and Indic ideas. Archaeological surveys along these routes have documented caravanserai foundations, pottery assemblages, and inscriptions recording commercial exchange. While these findings highlight the integration of remote highlands into larger regional networks, they do not substantiate the existence of a hidden kingdom fulfilling all the geographic, political, and eschatological criteria outlined in Kalachakra texts. Interpretive analysis of these archaeological records indicates three main points. First, material culture reflects a highland environment compatible with monastic and mercantile activity, demonstrating why these regions could inspire conceptions of remote, protected realms. Second, while settlements exhibit hierarchical structures, ritual complexity, and strategic placement, no evidence confirms the dynastic or eschatological attributes specifically associated with Shambhala. Third, the persistence of Shambhala in textual and ritual frameworks suggests that its geographic imagination functioned symbolically rather than empirically, using real landscapes as cognitive scaffolds for esoteric teaching. Expeditions in the Pamirs and Altai regions complement Himalayan surveys, providing comparative insight into highland social organization. Surveyors have recorded walled settlements, irrigation infrastructure, and burial practices that indicate long-term occupation and hierarchical governance. These findings align with descriptions of high-altitude resilience and political complexity, reinforcing the plausibility of envisioning protected kingdoms. Yet, critical examination of these sites demonstrates a consistent pattern. Archaeological evidence supports cultural, religious, and economic complexity, but does not correspond to a monolithic Shambhala polity with canonical kings, sacred geography, and prophetic cycles. Methodological approaches in these surveys emphasize rigorous documentation and comparative analysis. Researchers integrate stratigraphy, carbon dating, epigraphy, and GIS mapping to contextualize highland communities. Cross-referencing settlement data with Kalachakra and Tibetan commentaries enables scholars to evaluate correlations between material remains and textual narratives. While partial alignment exists in settlement distribution, ritual centers, and highland isolation, there is a systematic absence of evidence confirming the precise socio-political and eschatological claims attributed to Shambhala. Despite these gaps, Archaeological research elucidates the interplay between imagination and landscape. Monastic authors, travelers, and later interpreters likely drew upon the highland topography, isolated valleys, and strategic passes in constructing Shambhala's narrative. Material culture provided a plausible foundation for imagining protected kingdoms, while the symbolic and didactic dimensions of the Kalachakra texts elaborated on these landscapes into a fully developed mythic polity. This synthesis highlights the complementarity of textual and archaeological approaches. Archaeology informs understanding of environmental plausibility, while texts articulate ideological and ritual significance. By the late 20th century, extensive surveys across the Western Himalayas and Inner Asia had established a clear empirical boundary. While the regions provide the topographical and cultural conditions for imagining a hidden kingdom, no archaeological site meets the Kalachakra criteria for Shambhala. Findings consistently underscore the kingdom's function as a doctrinal, symbolic, and eschatological construct, rather than a historically verifiable polity. Material evidence situates Shambhala's myth within the broader context of Himalayan civilization, trade networks, monasticism, and highland resilience, providing a grounded framework for assessing the intersection of legend and landscape. Mapping efforts, however, reveal how imagined geography intersected with real landscapes, setting the stage for detailed cartographic, ethnographic, and textual studies that further contextualize Shambhala across Eurasia. For over a century, scholars have debated whether Shambhala reflects an actual region, a visionary realm, or a symbolic cosmological construct. The question of Shambhala's geographic identity has generated sustained debate among both Tibetan and Western scholars, often framed through three primary models: literal, symbolic, and hybrid. Literal interpretations posit Shambhala as a physically located northern kingdom, potentially situated in central or eastern Tibet, the Darim Basin, the Pamirs, or the Altai Mountains. Early Tibetan exegetes occasionally aligned Kalachakra references to identifiable geographic markers, using terms such as Baya Sa, northern land, to denote remote territories beyond conventional political frontiers. Monastic maps and commentary cycles frequently employ these terms alongside ritual and cosmological coordinates, reflecting attempts to integrate spiritual and territorial knowledge. Western scholars, beginning in the 19th century, often approached these references with comparative and ethnographic methods. Explorers and Orientalists, including Soma de Koros, Emil Schlagentweit, and Nicholas Rurik, cross-referenced Tibetan texts with existing maps and reports from Central Asian expeditions. Some argued for tangible correlates in the Pamirs or Xinjiang, citing topographical isolation, river systems, and valley networks that might correspond to Kalachakra descriptions. Others noted the absence of archaeological corroboration, emphasizing the improbability of a literal polity consistent with the detailed king lists, eschatological cycles, and ritual obligations specified in the Tantra. Symbolic models, in contrast, interpret Shambhala as primarily a cosmological or meditative construct, embedded within the Kalachakra framework. These approaches stress that geographic descriptors function allegorically, providing spatialized guidance for visualization practices, ethical cultivation, and tantric instruction. Within Tibetan scholasticism, commentators from the Rime, Gelik, and Jonang traditions frequently emphasize that references to a northern land serve as a mnemonic and ritual scaffold, rather than a literal historical claim. These interpretations highlight Shambhala's function as a pedagogical device, a mental landscape aligning meditation, ethical conduct, and eschatological timing. Hybrid models combine aspects of both perspectives, suggesting that Kalachakra authors drew upon real highland regions as inspiration for symbolically elaborated realms. Scholars advocating this view argue that topographical familiarity with high-altitude valleys, isolated passes, and monastic networks in regions such as western Tibet, Ladakh, and the upper Indus Basin informed the conceptualization of Shambhala. Textual coordinates, mountain ranges, and rivers in Kalachakra commentaries could correspond loosely to real features while being intentionally idealized or reinterpreted for doctrinal purposes. In this model, Shambhala occupies a liminal space between historical plausibility and cosmological didacticism. Recent methodological advances, including GIS-based mapping and landscape analysis, have facilitated more rigorous testing of geographic hypotheses. Researchers overlay Kalachakra descriptions with topographic, hydrological, and settlement data, seeking spatial congruencies. These analyses demonstrate that while certain highland areas share features consistent with Kalachakra depictions, such as relative isolation, defensibility, and proximity to historic trade corridors, no site fully satisfies the textual criteria for settlement pattern, fortification, or dynastic succession. GIS comparisons underscore the gap between textual imagination and material reality, suggesting that geographic correspondences are analogical rather than empirical. Interpretive assessment highlights three principal insights. First, literalist approaches provide a historical lens, illustrating how early Tibetan commentators situated cosmology within the known world. Second, symbolic readings underscore Shambhala's role as a pedagogical and esoteric construct, central to meditation, ritual, and ethical instruction. Third, hybrid models illuminate the interaction between geographic knowledge and doctrinal creativity, showing how physical landscapes informed, but did not dictate, the conceptual formation of a hidden kingdom. Collectively, these perspectives demonstrate the multidimensional complexity of Shambhala's geography within scholarly discourse. Textual analysis reinforces these conclusions. The Kalachakra Tantra and its Tibetan commentaries employ nested spatial coordinates, integrating cardinal directions, sacred mountains, and rivers into both ritual instruction and eschatological narrative. Cross-referencing these elements with regional topography reveals partial analogies but no unequivocal identification of a historical polity. The persistent use of Shambhala as a northern locus in ritual visualization supports its primacy as a cognitive and spiritual referent, even as literalist interpretations continue to appear in exploratory literature. By examining both Tibetan and Western scholarship, it becomes clear that Shambhala occupies a conceptual interface between observed landscapes and spiritual geography. Material surveys, cartographic analyses, and textual exegesis converge to suggest that while the kingdom's portrayal is grounded in awareness of highland terrains, its detailed political and eschatological features are doctrinally elaborated. Geographic modeling thus serves as a heuristic tool, illuminating the ways in which imaginative, religious, and pedagogical objectives intersected with empirical knowledge. With geographic debates clarified, the broader interpretive frameworks of Shambhala come into focus, encompassing historical, ritual, esoteric, and symbolic dimensions that inform both scholarly analysis and contemporary understanding. A comprehensive review of textual and archaeological evidence shows that Shambhala operates primarily as a conceptual realm. Historical evaluation of Shambhala as a literal, physical polity requires integrating archaeological, textual, and logistical data from the Himalayan and Central Asian highlands. Extensive surveys in regions such as Western Tibet, Ladakh, Mustang, the Pamirs, and the Altai provide detailed records of settlement patterns, fortifications, and trade networks, yet none align fully with the Kalachakra specifications of a centralized kingdom ruled by 32 successive kings. Excavated monasteries, walled villages, and caravan stops illustrate the capacity for organized political activity, but do not corroborate a polity combining eschatological, dynastic, and geographic features in the manner described in canonical texts. Logistical considerations further challenge the literalist hypothesis. The Kalachakra describes Shambhala as a northern realm with structured governance, extensive agricultural production, and strategic access to surrounding territories. Analysis of terrain, climate, and high-altitude ecology indicates that valleys capable of sustaining small populations were indeed available, but the scale implied by a dynastic kingdom, including administrative oversight, defensive infrastructure, and population density, would have been exceedingly difficult to sustain in these environments. High-altitude agriculture, limited arable land, and seasonal isolation constrain the feasibility of a kingdom matching textual descriptions. Trade and communication networks provide additional points of evaluation. Historical caravan routes connecting the Darim Basin, Kashmir, and Western Tibet facilitated economic exchange, movement of monastic personnel, and cultural transmission, Archaeological evidence documents caravanserai, inscriptions, and material artifacts consistent with regional integration. However, these networks do not substantiate the existence of a discrete, self-contained polity corresponding to Shambhala's narrative chronology or the socio-political centrality described in the Kalachakra. Instead, these routes support a conceptual plausibility for imagining remote, protected territories that could serve as narrative models within religious literature. Comparative textual analysis reinforces this conclusion. Examination of Kalachakra manuscripts, Tibetan commentaries, and rime-era syntheses reveals a consistent pattern. Shambhala functions as a doctrinal, ethical, and eschatological referent. The detailed enumeration of kings, their attributes, and chronological succession appears aligned with pedagogical objectives, ritual timing, and meditation guidance, rather than historical reporting. Cross-referencing these features with known historical polities in northern India, Central Asia, and Tibet demonstrates that while the texts draw upon familiar political structures, they deliberately abstract and idealize these features to convey doctrinal principles. Interpretive insights highlight three dimensions of this evaluation. First, the physical implausibility of sustaining a kingdom of the scale and complexity described in the texts within the high-altitude Himalayan environment underscores Shambhala's symbolic orientation. Second, textual structure and ritual integration indicate that narrative and chronological precision served meditative and ethical instruction rather than empirical documentation. Third, the consistency across centuries of commentarial treatment, from early Tibetan exegesis through modern Gelic codifications, demonstrates that Shambhala's enduring significance derives from doctrinal function rather than historical reality. Historical methodology also considers the broader socio-political and cultural contexts in which Shambhala narratives evolved. Buddhist expansion into Tibet, institutional consolidation under Gelic monastic networks, and integration into international Kalachakra dissemination created frameworks in which Shambhala could be both a cognitive and ritual scaffold. Its role in initiating ethical behavior, structuring meditation, and articulating eschatological cycles provided functional coherence across dispersed communities. These functional criteria, rather than geographic verification, account for the kingdom's persistence in religious imagination and textual tradition. Scholars examining Shambhala from a historical critical perspective emphasize its constructive role, a model polity serving doctrinal and eschatological purposes. No archaeological site has yielded evidence of a kingdom matching Kalachakra specifications. No historical record independently corroborates the succession of 32 kings or the precise socio-political structures described. Instead, the texts illustrate a sophisticated fusion of real-world observations, symbolic geography, and doctrinal elaboration, demonstrating the capacity of religious literature to create fully developed conceptual spaces without requiring empirical existence. In conclusion, the integration of archaeological, logistical, textual, and historical analyses converges on a single interpretation. Shambhala cannot be identified as a verifiable historical polity. Its features, including geography, kingship, and eschatology, operate primarily as didactic and symbolic constructs, facilitating ritual, meditation, and ethical instruction within the Kalachakra framework. While inspired by highland landscapes and Himalayan socio-political realities, Shambhala remains a product of doctrinal imagination, sustained by centuries of textual transmission, commentary, and ritual performance. With its physical status addressed, the next chapters turn to Shambhala's ideological and symbolic roles, examining its function in meditation, eschatology, and global cultural discourse. In doctrinal terms, Shambhala represents a structured cosmological axis rather than a fixed geographic domain. Within the Kalachakra Tantra, Shambhala occupies a central position in Buddhist cosmology, functioning as a model kingdom embedded in the cycles of time and space. The text situates the kingdom in relation to the mythical geography of Mount Meru, the cosmic axis around which continents, oceans, and celestial spheres are arranged. Kalachakra commentaries elaborate that Shambhala lies in the northern region relative to Mount Meru, positioned within a broader framework of cardinally aligned continents and sacred topographies. These descriptions serve not as literal geographic coordinates but as schematic guides for ritual visualization, ethical instruction, and meditative practice, providing practitioners with a cognitive map linking human society to cosmic order. The cyclical nature of time, central to Kalachakra doctrine, further contextualizes Shambhala. The Tantra employs the concept of kalpas, vast epochs in which the universe undergoes recurring creation, decay, and renewal. Shambhala is described as a temporal and moral constant within these cycles, preserving dharma and upholding virtuous governance across successive ages. Canonical sources, including the Tibetan Kalachakra commentarial corpus, enumerate 32 kings whose reigns extend through multiple cycles, exemplifying continuity, moral rectitude, and spiritual authority. The succession of kings thus illustrates how Shambhala functions as a temporal anchor, linking human governance to cosmic rhythm. Textual analysis reveals that Shambhala's cosmological role is inseparable from Tantric eschatology. The Kalachakra describes a prophesied future invasion of the Buddhist world by forces of degeneration, followed by the emergence of a messianic king, Rudra Chakran, who restores Dharma from Shambhala. This eschatological projection situates Shambhala as a locus of moral and spiritual renewal, a center from which ethical and meditative power radiates outward. The kingdom's position within the northern quadrant of the cosmological map underscores its symbolic function as a protective, regenerating force rather than a conventionally governed territory. Through this lens, Shambhala operates as a didactic tool for envisioning the interplay between temporal order and spiritual authority. Ritual manuals and monastic exegeses further illustrate Shambhala's role in visualization practices. During Kalachakra initiations, practitioners mentally construct the kingdom's landscape, palace, and royal lineages, integrating ethical, meditative, and cosmological elements into a unified cognitive exercise. Commentaries stress precise alignment of cardinal directions, the placement of sacred mountains, and the enumeration of kings, linking spatial organization to moral and spiritual discipline. These exercises highlight the interdependence of cosmology, meditation, and ethical instruction, demonstrating that Shambhala functions as a schematic model kingdom within the mind, as well as the broader cosmos. Analytical insights emerge from the interplay of textual, ritual, and cosmological evidence. First, the Kalachakra positions Shambhala as an axial reference point, linking human political order to universal processes. Second, its representation across cycles emphasizes the durability of dharma and virtuous governance as constants within mutable temporal and material conditions. Third, the integration of Shambhala into meditation and ritual demonstrates the practical application of cosmological knowledge, using imaginative geography to cultivate ethical awareness and spiritual insight. Collectively, these elements indicate that Shambhala operates primarily as a doctrinal and cognitive construct, embodying moral, temporal, and cosmological principles rather than physical reality. Comparative examination of commentarial traditions highlights the stability and variation of Shambhala's cosmological role. Raimara scholars, Geluk commentators, and Jonong exegeses consistently situate the kingdom in relation to Mount Meru and the cardinal quadrants, though interpretive emphasis varies. Some emphasize its eschatological function, particularly in prophesied cycles of Dharma restoration, while others focus on its utility for structured meditation and ritual visualization. This multiplicity illustrates the flexibility of Shambhala's conceptual design, allowing it to serve as both a moral exemplar and a meditational framework across diverse scholastic and sectarian contexts. Textual cross-referencing reinforces the conceptual over physical orientation of Shambhala. In the Kalachakra and related commentaries, descriptions of terrain, fortifications, and royal succession operate analogically, supporting meditative construction rather than empirical observation. Mountains, rivers, and cities are schematized to communicate moral and ritual order. The sequence of kings embodies the interplay between temporal governance and spiritual authority. These textual strategies underscore the kingdom's function as an integrated doctrinal apparatus, facilitating the transmission of Kalachakra ethics, cosmology, and eschatology to practitioners across temporal and spatial distances. In conclusion, Shambhala's cosmological placement demonstrates its primary function as a structured model kingdom within the Buddhist universe. Its association with Mount Meru, cyclical time, and tantric eschatology reflects a sophisticated integration of ethical, temporal, and meditative objectives. By situating the kingdom within a cosmic framework rather than a fixed geographic space, the Kalachakra establishes Shambhala as a doctrinal axis, supporting visualization practices, ethical cultivation, and eschatological understanding. Its enduring presence in Tibetan commentaries, initiation rituals, and scholarly exegesis confirms that the kingdom's significance lies not in historical verification, but in its cosmological, moral, and pedagogical utility. This cosmological framing sets the stage for Shambhala's eschatological significance, where the kingdom's moral and spiritual authority intersects with prophesied restoration and global dharma. The Shambhala prophecy outlines a future age of renewal governed by a righteous ruler, framed within Buddhist cosmology rather than political prediction. Central to the Kalachakra Tantra is the narrative of a prophesied final battle, led by the 32nd Kalki king, Rudrachakran, who restores dharma to a world experiencing moral and spiritual decay. Canonical sources, including Tibetan translations and early commentaries, describe this event in highly structured eschatological terms, situating it within the larger cycles of kalpas and cosmic time. The narrative emphasizes the preservation of ethical order and the triumph of dharma, integrating moral, ritual, and cosmological elements into a cohesive doctrinal framework. Historical and textual analysis demonstrates that the prophecy functions as a didactic and ritual instrument, rather than a literal geopolitical forecast. Within the Kalachakra corpus, the war cycle is depicted as a multi-stage event. Initially, forces of adharma, often described as external aggressors or morally degenerate peoples, expand across regions traditionally identified in the northern and western sectors of the cosmological map. The narrative specifies the mobilization of Shambhala's army under the Kalki king, highlighting principles of righteous governance, discipline, and ethical conduct. Commentarial texts, including rhyme angelic exegeses, stress that these descriptions serve as symbolic markers for moral vigilance, illustrating the consequences of ethical and spiritual neglect within society. Textual evidence further situates the Shambhala prophecy within ritual and meditative practice. Kalachakra initiates are instructed to visualize the Kalki king, his retinue, and the strategic disposition of forces as part of advanced tantric exercises. Monastic commentaries clarify that these visualizations are intended to cultivate personal virtue, ethical discernment, and spiritual readiness. By engaging meditatively with the narrative, practitioners internalize the principles of righteous leadership, moral rectitude, and dharmic restoration, aligning individual conduct with cosmological order. Interpretive scholarship highlights three analytical insights regarding the prophecy. First, the narrative's chronological specificity, enumerating kings and detailing successive campaigns, functions primarily as a pedagogical tool, illustrating cause and effect relationships in moral and political domains. Second, its integration with cosmological cycles situates human events within larger temporal structures, reinforcing the principle that ethical action is consequential across ages. Third, by framing conflict within the ethical and spiritual sphere rather than empirical military history, the Kalachakra provides a metaphysical model of justice and renewal, allowing practitioners to conceptualize the interplay between morality, leadership, and cosmic order. Comparative textual analysis reveals variation in emphasis among Tibetan scholastic traditions. Rhyme commentators often highlight the symbolic and visionary aspects, portraying Rudrachakran as a didactic archetype whose leadership exemplifies the harmonization of spiritual and temporal authority. Angelic exegeses focus on ritualized practice, codifying visualization procedures and ethical precepts connected to the prophetic cycle. Jonong and early Kagyu interpretations occasionally underscore metaphysical dimensions, linking the prophecy to the Jintong understanding of ultimate reality, thereby integrating Shambhala's eschatology with broader doctrinal debates. Across these variations, a consistent pattern emerges. The prophecy is doctrinally functional rather than empirically descriptive. Historical methodology reinforces this conclusion. No independent historical or archaeological evidence confirms the occurrence of events analogous to the Shambhala war cycle. Geopolitical correspondences suggested by literalist readings of the text are inconsistent with known regional histories of Central and Inner Asia. Instead, the prophetic narrative exemplifies the integration of ethical, cosmological, and ritual concerns into structured eschatology, producing a cognitive and moral model rather than a literal forecast of temporal events. The narrative also serves a social and institutional function. By codifying the ideals of righteous kingship, discipline, and ethical conduct, the prophecy provides a normative framework for monastic leaders, lay adherents, and meditators. Kalachakra initiations, public or monastic, enact these principles symbolically, reinforcing communal cohesion and doctrinal alignment. The war cycle, therefore, operates as a social ethical allegory, illustrating the consequences of moral decay and the pathways to restoration through dharmic governance and spiritual discipline. In addition, the prophecy exemplifies the relationship between local and universal frameworks. While situated conceptually in northern Shambhala, its ethical and ritual dimensions extend across the practitioner's cognitive and spiritual landscape. The narrative functions as a lens through which moral conduct, meditation practice, and communal responsibility are interrelated with cosmic cycles. Textual precision, including the enumeration of kings, succession patterns, and eschatological timing, supports this integrated didactic purpose, ensuring that the prophecy remains a structured tool for spiritual and ethical development rather than a literal geopolitical prediction. In conclusion, the Shambhala war cycle serves multiple doctrinal functions. It embodies moral exemplars, situates human governance within cosmic time, and integrates ritual visualization with ethical instruction. Analytical study across Tibetan scholastic traditions, textual commentaries, and ritual manuals indicates that the narrative's purpose is symbolic, pedagogical, and eschatological. While superficially resembling a military forecast, it is in fact a construct of doctrinal imagination, designed to illustrate dharmic principles, spiritual vigilance, and the ethical responsibilities of leadership. By understanding the prophecy in these terms, scholars and practitioners can differentiate traditional Buddhist intent from modern political or apocalyptic interpretations. With prophecy defined, we can assess Shambhala's role as a social and ethical ideal, examining how its symbolic structures inform monastic instruction, meditation practice, and community ethics. In Tibetan literature, Shambhala often serves as a model of governance, education, and ethical order. Across Kalachakra commentaries and rime-era syntheses, Shambhala is consistently depicted as an idealized polity where social, ethical, and educational structures align with Buddhist doctrinal principles. Scholars such as Jamgon Kongtrul, Jamyang Khyentse Wangpa, angelic commentators emphasize that the kingdom embodies a synthesis of moral rectitude, intellectual cultivation, and ritual observance. The succession of kings, from Suchandra to Rudrachakran, functions not only as a chronological framework but as a model of virtuous leadership, demonstrating how governance can integrate spiritual insight, ethical discipline, and public welfare. Central to Shambhala's portrayal is the institutionalization of education and ethical training. Textual sources describe systematic instruction in both monastic and lay contexts, with curricula encompassing doctrinal study, meditation practice, and ethical conduct. The kingdom's leaders are said to maintain oversight of educational systems, ensuring that citizens cultivate both wisdom and virtue, a theme mirrored in Tibetan utopian literature. Such depictions align Shambhala with broader Buddhist ideals of Sangha-centered governance, where the moral and intellectual formation of society is inseparable from doctrinal fidelity. Ethical discipline forms another key dimension of the kingdom's representation. Kalachakra texts and Tibetan exegeses portray Shambhala as a society in which adherence to dharma, nonviolence, and ritual propriety is systematically enforced. Officials and citizens alike are expected to maintain personal virtue, participate in religious observances, and embody the principles of compassion, justice, and moral accountability. Scholarly interpretations underscore that this regulatory framework functions as a pedagogical exemplar, Shambhala is less a historically realized state than a normative template for ethical governance. Political philosophy within Shambhala narratives further illustrates its didactic role. Commentators draw parallels with Buddhist utopian literature, noting that the kingdom demonstrates the possibility of integrating temporal authority with spiritual oversight. Successive kings exemplify the principles of dharmic rulership, ensuring that the administration is guided by moral imperatives rather than mere pragmatism. The careful delineation of succession, bureaucratic oversight, and ritualized ceremonies reinforces the message that social stability is contingent upon ethical and spiritual alignment. Interpretive insights emerge from three primary observations. First, Shambhala provides a conceptual template for polity building, modeling how leadership, education, and ethical discipline can be harmonized within a Buddhist framework. Second, its depiction as a morally and intellectually ordered society reflects the pedagogical ambitions of Tibetan scholasticism, illustrating the integration of meditation, doctrinal instruction, and ethical cultivation in shaping ideal communities. Third, by situating Shambhala in an eschatological and cosmological context, scholars demonstrate that Tibetan writers used the kingdom as a moral and spiritual horizon, guiding both individual practice and communal organization. Comparative study of Kalachakra exegesis highlights both continuity and variation. Rhyme scholars often emphasize visionary and ethical aspects, portraying the kingdom as a model of virtue accessible through meditation and moral cultivation. Gelic commentaries codify the role of Shambhala within structured ritual and curricular frameworks, linking ethical and educational ideals to monastic administration. Janong and Kagyu interpretations occasionally stress metaphysical dimensions, aligning societal order with broader doctrinal cosmology. Despite these differences, a common feature persists. Shambhala functions as a didactic, ethical, and social exemplar, illustrating principles rather than asserting historical actuality. The textual and ritual emphasis on social order aligns with material and intellectual conditions of pre-modern Himalayan polities, including the need for disciplined monastic governance and centralized oversight of doctrinal education. While Shambhala itself remains non-empirical, its representation reflects concerns familiar to Tibetan intellectuals, ensuring social cohesion, aligning secular authority with spiritual authority, and fostering ethical cultivation. This alignment underscores the symbolic efficacy of Shambhala as a cognitive and cultural model, rather than a realized political entity. In conclusion, Shambhala operates as an integrated model society, exemplifying governance, education, and ethical discipline within a doctrinally grounded framework. Its structured hierarchy, emphasis on moral and intellectual cultivation, and codification in commentarial literature illustrate the kingdom's enduring function as a normative ideal. While not historically verifiable, Shambhala's depiction provides a sustained template for Tibetan scholastic, monastic, and meditative practice, demonstrating the intersection of ethical philosophy, pedagogy, and cosmological imagination in Buddhist thought. Having explored its symbolic roles, we now turn to Shambhala's global afterlife, examining how its doctrinal and imaginative structures have influenced modern cultural, religious, and scholarly contexts. Modern scholarship approaches Shambhala through historical method, philology, and critical textual analysis. Contemporary study of Shambhala situates the kingdom within rigorous academic frameworks, drawing on historical, philological, and textual methodologies. Scholars such as David Rigel, John Newman, Vesna Wallace, and Jeffrey Samuel have analyzed Kalachakra manuscripts, Tibetan commentaries, and related Buddhist literature to clarify Shambhala's doctrinal, cosmological, and eschatological dimensions. Their work systematically distinguishes textual description from historical reality, emphasizing that Shambhala's function within the Kalachakra tradition is primarily conceptual and ritual, rather than empirical. Philological analysis provides a foundational approach. Examination of Sanskrit originals, Tibetan translations, and variant manuscript traditions enables scholars to trace the evolution of terminology, narrative structures, and doctrinal emphases. For example, Rigel's comparative studies of early Sanskrit fragments and Tibetan commentaries highlight the chronological and textual development of the 32-king lineage and the eschatological framework associated with Rudra Chakran. Similarly, Wallace's work on Kalachakra commentaries illuminates regional adaptations, transmission patterns, and sectarian interpretations, demonstrating the complex interaction between Indian textual sources and Tibetan scholastic culture. Historical contextualization forms another major component of contemporary scholarship. Researchers examine political, social, and monastic structures of medieval Tibet and northern India to situate the emergence of Shambhala narratives within real-world conditions. Studies of Gelic institutionalization, Rime-era polymath commentary, and the spread of tantric instruction reveal how doctrinal, political, and social dynamics contributed to the formation and consolidation of Shambhala imagery. Textual evidence is cross-referenced with archaeological surveys, monastic catalogs, and ritual manuals, producing an integrative understanding of how Shambhala functioned in scholastic and ritual practice. Doctrinal analysis emphasizes the role of Shambhala within Kalachakra cosmology and eschatology. Scholars critically examine prophetic, meditative, and ritual dimensions, highlighting their pedagogical and ethical functions. Newman, for instance, analyzes initiation manuals to demonstrate that visualization of Shambhala is not an exercise in geographical accuracy, but a tool for cultivating moral and spiritual insight. Comparative study of Rime, Gelic, and Jonang interpretations further reveals both consistency in core principles and diversity in exegetically emphasis, underscoring the flexibility of doctrinal application across sectarian and historical contexts. Methodologically, contemporary research emphasizes source criticism, manuscript collation, and interdisciplinary approaches. Philology is combined with historical geography, archaeology, and comparative religious studies to evaluate both literalist and symbolic claims. This allows scholars to distinguish the conceptual structures underlying Shambhala narratives from attempts at geographic identification or esoteric speculation. Such approaches have clarified centuries of debate, demonstrating that while Shambhala has inspired exploration, mapping, and popular imagination, its primary significance resides in ritual, pedagogical, and ethical domains. Interpretive insights highlight 3 points. First, modern scholarship confirms that Shambhala functions as a doctrinal construct, supporting meditative, ethical, and eschatological instruction. Second, detailed textual analysis demonstrates that Kalachakra narratives are internally coherent, linking lineage, prophecy, and cosmology with deliberate pedagogical structure. Third, contextualizing Shambhala within historical Tibet and northern India illustrates the interaction between institutional religion, scholastic debate, and symbolic imagination, explaining its persistent relevance without requiring empirical verification. Additionally, contemporary studies address the diffusion of Kalachakra and Shambhala teachings globally. Research on post-1959 diaspora scholarship, translation projects, and international Kalachakra initiations highlights the adaptation of traditional Tibetan models to cross-cultural contexts. Academic attention ensures that these modern interpretations are assessed with reference to canonical and common aerial sources, preserving fidelity to doctrinal intent while analyzing contemporary reception, globalization, and cultural translation. In summary, academic scholarship approaches Shambhala through philology, historical method, and doctrinal analysis, integrating textual study with historical and ritual context. Work by Rigel, Newman, Wallace, Samuel, and others demonstrates that Shambhala's significance is rooted in conceptual, ritual, and ethical functions, rather than empirical geographic or political reality. By systematically differentiating textual construction from historical verification, contemporary studies provide a framework for understanding Shambhala as a central cognitive and spiritual concept within Kalachakra Buddhist practice. Beyond academia, Shambhala also appears in diverse spiritual movements, where its symbolic and esoteric dimensions have been reinterpreted for global audiences. In the contemporary era, Shambhala has been adopted and reinterpreted by a variety of new religious movements. From the mid-20th century onward, Shambhala became a focal point for a range of Tibetan Buddhism, inspired and Western syncretic traditions, often emphasizing esoteric, meditative, or utopian ideals. Movements such as the Shambhala Buddhist lineage established by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche and affiliated organizations incorporated Kalachakra teachings, while introducing novel interpretations of Shambhala as a symbol of enlightened society. Central to these reinterpretations is the emphasis on practical application of meditation, ethical leadership, and social engagement, framed less in eschatological terms than in psychological and ethical pedagogy. In these contexts, Shambhala is frequently presented as a living spiritual principle, realized through meditation, community structure, and ethical action. Trungpa and his successors articulated Shambhala as a warrior society, in which awareness, compassion, and discipline cultivate enlightened behavior. Textual references to Rudra Chakran or the Northern Kingdom are interpreted symbolically, serving as cognitive and aspirational models rather than literal prophecies. Contemporary practitioners are encouraged to internalize these principles in daily life, reflecting a pragmatic and psychological adaptation of traditional doctrine. Western syncretic movements, particularly within Theosophy, New Age, and occult traditions, also recontextualized Shambhala. Figures such as Alice Bailey, the early Theosophists, and Rosicrucian-influenced groups incorporated Shambhala into frameworks of cosmic evolution, spiritual hierarchy, and hidden wisdom traditions. These reinterpretations often blend Tibetan textual motifs with European esotericism, producing a vision of Shambhala as a universal center of enlightened guidance. While aesthetically and ideologically compelling, these adaptations diverge significantly from canonical Kalachakra sources, particularly in the emphasis on hidden masters, cosmic initiation, and globalized esoteric agendas. Academic study of these movements highlights the distinction between doctrinal fidelity and adaptive reinterpretation. Scholars such as Jeffrey Samuel and David Rigel note that Shambhala's use in modern spiritual movements tends to prioritize ethical, pedagogical, and utopian ideals, sometimes merging or conflating disparate religious or philosophical frameworks. While these movements borrow textual elements, such as the sequence of kings, cosmological orientation, or meditative visualization, they often reinterpret them to suit contemporary organizational, ethical, or esoteric purposes rather than preserving historical or ritual accuracy. Interpretive insights emerge from three analytical perspectives. First, Shambhala functions as a malleable symbol, capable of conveying ethical, social, or spiritual ideals across cultures and historical periods. Second, the adaptation of Shambhala within new religious movements illustrates the flexibility of textual and ritual frameworks, showing how meditation, visualization, and moral exemplars can be reframed to align with modern spiritual aspirations. Third, the divergence between canonical and syncretic interpretations underscores the importance of contextual and textual literacy, enabling scholars and practitioners to differentiate traditional Kalachakra intent from contemporary ideological adaptation. Case studies further illustrate these dynamics. The Shambhala International Organization systematized meditation, ritual, and social practice around the principles of Shambhala, explicitly framing leadership, ethics, and community as extensions of enlightened governance. In contrast, New Age publications and global esoteric networks emphasize Shambhala as a cosmic locus or hidden civilization, often de-emphasizing Tibetan textual sources in favor of universalized spiritual narratives. Comparative analysis demonstrates that while these modern iterations draw inspiration from Kalachakra literature, their hermeneutic strategies and doctrinal priorities diverge substantially. Moreover, contemporary scholarly assessment recognizes the global dissemination of Shambhala teachings and the tensions that arise between traditional authority and popular reinterpretation. Tibetan exiles, monastic authorities, and Western spiritual entrepreneurs negotiate claims over textual fidelity, ritual practice, and interpretive legitimacy. These dynamics exemplify how Shambhala has become a transnational concept, simultaneously maintaining doctrinal roots and adapting to culturally diverse audiences, educational models, and ethical frameworks. In conclusion, the adoption of Shambhala in new religious movements reflects both continuity and transformation. While rooted in Kalachakra texts and Tibetan scholastic tradition, modern interpretations frequently emphasize internalized practice, ethical development, and social or spiritual utopia. Academic evaluation demonstrates that these reconfigurations are symbolic and pedagogical, rather than literal or historical, highlighting the enduring appeal and conceptual flexibility of Shambhala across temporal, geographic, and cultural boundaries. The concept also extends into literature and media, where Shambhala has become a cultural and imaginative reference beyond religious practice. In global media, Shambhala often appears as a generalized symbol of hidden wisdom. Across the 20th and 21st centuries, Shambhala has become a recurring motif in literature, adventure fiction, cinema, and interactive media, often detached from its original Kalachakra and Tibetan doctrinal context. Early travel narratives and adventure novels, such as Nicholas Roerich's expedition accounts, presented Shambhala as a mysterious, remote kingdom in the Himalayas, combining geographic speculation with mystical themes. These accounts inspired fictional adaptations in Western literature, emphasizing exploration, hidden civilizations, and utopian ideals. In novels and adventure fiction, Shambhala is frequently depicted as a concealed or lost kingdom, accessible only to initiates or heroic explorers. Authors often appropriate the imagery of the 32 kings, prophetic cycles, and utopian governance, but repurpose these elements for narrative suspense or moral allegory. The Kalachakra cosmology and eschatological dimensions are rarely preserved. Instead, Shambhala functions as a mythic topos, symbolizing human aspiration, moral refinement, or esoteric knowledge. Cinematic adaptations follow similar patterns. Films and documentaries inspired by Himalayan exploration, spiritual quests, or fantasy motifs frequently reference Shambhala as a hidden land of wisdom or treasure, often emphasizing exoticism, perilous terrain, and transcendental knowledge. While visually and narratively engaging, these portrayals rarely maintain textual or doctrinal fidelity, instead drawing selectively on Western Orientalist or New Age sources. Such media often conflate Shambhala with generalized Eastern mysticism or global utopian ideals, reflecting imaginative reception rather than scholarly analysis. Interactive media, including video games and speculative fiction, further extend Shambhala's cultural reach. The kingdom is frequently incorporated as a setting for adventure, strategy, or role-playing scenarios, with its cosmology, kingship, and eschatological prophecy abstracted into game mechanics or narrative tropes. In these contexts, Shambhala functions as a symbol of hidden mastery, wisdom, or ultimate achievement, providing cross-cultural narrative resonance while remaining disconnected from canonical Buddhist frameworks. Despite divergence from textual sources, these representations often draw indirectly on historical scholarship and ethnographic accounts. Roerich's expeditions, early Orientalist studies, and theosophical reinterpretations provided narrative scaffolding that authors, filmmakers, and game designers adapted. Academic analysis distinguishes these media portrayals from doctrinally grounded understanding, emphasizing the creative, symbolic, and myth-making functions of Shambhala within global culture. Analytical insights emerge from three perspectives. First, Shambhala's adaptation into literature and media demonstrates its symbolic elasticity, allowing reinterpretation across diverse narrative and cultural frameworks. Second, the divergence from Tibetan textual fidelity illustrates how mythic motifs migrate independently of original doctrinal or historical contexts, shaped by aesthetic, ideological, or commercial priorities. Third, the continued presence of Shambhala in global media underscores the enduring resonance of its utopian, ethical, and esoteric associations, which can be recontextualized to suit contemporary imaginative frameworks. Comparative study of literary and media sources highlights specific patterns. Shambhala frequently embodies hidden knowledge, ethical perfection, or moral challenge, reflecting a conceptual continuity with the Kalachakra tradition, albeit stripped of ritual, cosmological, or eschatological precision. Narrative constructions often combine elements from Tibetan Buddhism, theosophy, and adventure fiction, producing hybridized representations that are simultaneously culturally accessible and historically distinct from the textual tradition. The creative appropriation of kingship, prophecy, and sacred geography illustrates how Shambhala functions as a transcultural motif, mediating between scholarly, spiritual, and popular domains. In conclusion, Shambhala's role in global literature, popular media, and myth-making reflects a layered reception history, in which canonical Buddhist sources, theosophical reinterpretations, and imaginative exploration converge. While modern portrayals often diverge from historical and doctrinal accuracy, they maintain the kingdom's essential symbolic resonance as a locus of hidden wisdom, ethical order, and spiritual aspiration. Understanding this reception history provides clarity for both scholars and the public, distinguishing factual, doctrinal, and imaginative dimensions of the Shambhala narrative. With its global image explored, the final chapter evaluates Shambhala's historical and intellectual legacy, integrating textual, ritual, and cultural perspectives. In Tibetan and global Buddhism, Shambhala remains central to Kalachakra ritual and eschatological thought. Shambhala's intellectual influence within Tibetan Buddhism is extensive, encompassing ritual, textual, and symbolic domains. Kalachakra initiations, both historical and contemporary, incorporate detailed visualization of Shambhala as an ethical, political, and cosmological model. Ritual manuals emphasize the kingdom's governance structure, succession of kings, and moral order, reflecting centuries of scholastic refinement. These rituals reinforce not only individual meditation practice but also communal participation, consolidating monastic authority and embedding Shambhala into institutional Buddhist culture. Textual scholarship further demonstrates Shambhala's enduring significance. Monastic commentaries from Geluk, Rime, Jonong, and Kagyu traditions continue to explicate the Kalachakra's eschatological, ethical, and cosmological dimensions. Scholars document how Shambhala serves as a cognitive and moral horizon, guiding meditation, doctrinal study, and ethical conduct. By framing Shambhala within systematic cosmology, commentaries create a rigorous pedagogical structure that aligns visionary elements with normative practice, exemplifying the integration of doctrinal abstraction and lived monastic discipline. Historically, Shambhala also functions as a symbol of legitimate political authority, particularly in Tibetan governance. The succession of kings and their adherence to dharmic principles provides a model for righteous leadership, which was adapted metaphorically within monastic hierarchies and, at times, in Tibetan relations with external powers such as the Mongols and Qing dynasty. Even as the kingdom's physical existence remained conceptual, its symbolic authority shaped ritualized political ideology, linking spiritual aspiration with social and administrative order. In the modern era, Shambhala's influence extends to transnational Buddhist networks. The global diaspora of Tibetan teachers after 1959, combined with the institutionalization of Kalachakra initiations worldwide, has propagated Shambhala as a unifying doctrinal and ethical motif. Scholars and practitioners alike note that the kingdom serves as a shared reference point for cross-cultural ritual and ethical teaching, mediating continuity between Tibetan scholastic tradition and international audiences. Its presence in contemporary meditation programs, textual translations, and international initiations underscores the role of Shambhala in sustaining a coherent transnational Buddhist identity. Interpretive insights highlight three dimensions of Shambhala's intellectual legacy. First, it functions as a ritual and pedagogical template, structuring meditative visualization, ethical instruction, and eschatological expectation. Second, Shambhala's conceptualization illustrates the integration of moral philosophy with doctrinal cosmology, demonstrating how Tibetan Buddhist thought systematizes ethical, political, and metaphysical principles into coherent frameworks. Third, the global dissemination of Kalachakra and Shambhala teachings shows how doctrinal models can maintain fidelity while adapting to diverse cultural and linguistic contexts, ensuring continuity and relevance across centuries and continents. Critical scholarship confirms that while Shambhala is not a verifiable polity, its functional reality within Buddhist intellectual life is substantial. Philological studies, ritual manuals, and historical commentaries provide evidence of sustained engagement with its geography, kingship, and ethical schema. Researchers such as David Reigel, Jeffrey Samuel, and Vesna Wallace demonstrate that Shambhala serves multiple roles simultaneously. It is pedagogical, eschatological, symbolic, and socially illustrative, functioning as a conceptual anchor for ritual practice, meditation, and scholastic reflection. Moreover, Shambhala illustrates how symbolic constructs can shape institutional culture. In monastic curricula, Kalachakra studies, including visualizations of the kingdom and its rulers, support both doctrinal literacy and ethical training. These frameworks facilitate communal cohesion, structured learning, and moral cultivation, illustrating that textual and ritual constructs have practical consequences for organizational, intellectual, and spiritual life within Tibetan Buddhism. In conclusion, Shambhala's intellectual legacy is both deeply historical and dynamically contemporary. Within Tibetan Buddhism, it continues to guide ritual practice, scholarly commentary, and institutional governance. Globally, it fosters a shared ethical and doctrinal horizon, supporting the dissemination of Kalachakra teachings while maintaining conceptual fidelity. By integrating ritual, pedagogy, ethics, and cosmology, Shambhala exemplifies the enduring power of conceptual and symbolic models to structure belief, practice, and communal identity across time and space. The concept extends beyond religious domains, influencing secular literature, esoteric movements, and global imagination. Across the modern world, Shambhala continues to influence cultural narratives about hidden knowledge and remote civilizations. Shambhala's impact extends well beyond doctrinal and ritual frameworks, entering literature, exploration history, and philosophical discourse. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European explorers, Orientalists, and esoteric thinkers frequently referenced Shambhala as a concealed Himalayan kingdom, blending adventure, mysticism, and speculation. Figures such as Nicholas Roerich, Soma de Koros, and early theosophists employed Shambhala as a symbol of ultimate wisdom, projecting ideals of spiritual perfection and moral governance onto distant landscapes. These interpretations often shaped Western perceptions of the Himalayas, casting the region as a locus of esoteric knowledge and transcendental civilization. Literary adaptations and popular media further reinforced Shambhala's cultural presence. Adventure novels, fantasy literature, and later cinematic productions presented the kingdom as a hidden utopia, accessible only to initiates, explorers, or morally upright protagonists. While these portrayals frequently diverge from Tibetan textual sources, they preserve a core imaginative association. Shambhala represents an intersection of remoteness, ethical order, and esoteric insight. Scholars note that these representations reflect both Orientalist influences and broader human fascination with utopian or concealed civilizations, demonstrating the capacity of textual motifs to migrate into global narrative culture. Philosophical and esoteric movements have also drawn on Shambhala as a symbolic locus of spiritual evolution. The Theosophical Society, New Age circles, and Western Buddhist-inspired organizations interpreted the kingdom in terms of hidden wisdom, cosmic hierarchy, and moral guidance, sometimes integrating concepts such as hidden masters or universal enlightenment. While these reinterpretations diverge significantly from canonical Kalachakra sources, they highlight the conceptual flexibility of Shambhala, allowing it to serve as a model for ethical aspiration and esoteric knowledge in contexts far removed from Tibetan monasticism. Exploration history demonstrates how Shambhala functioned as both a geographical hypothesis and ideological touchstone. Expeditions into the Himalayas, the Pamirs, and Central Asia, though often guided by conjecture rather than textual verification, used Shambhala as a framework to structure journeys, mapping projects, and ethnographic inquiry. Reports from Russian, British, and European explorers often conflated Shambhala with remote highland polities, reflecting both Western cartographic ambitions and imaginative projection. Academic review clarifies that while these expeditions rarely verified the kingdom's physical existence, they contributed to the enduring symbolic resonance of Shambhala in global imagination. Interpretive analysis highlights three key dimensions of cultural influence. First, Shambhala functions as a transcultural symbol, mediating between Tibetan Buddhist textual traditions and Western intellectual, literary, and spiritual discourses. Second, its reception illustrates the interplay between textual fidelity and imaginative adaptation, showing how a concept rooted in specific ritual and doctrinal frameworks can acquire global mythic and philosophical significance. Third, Shambhala's role in exploration, literature, and esotericism demonstrates the capacity of symbolic geography to shape perceptions of remote regions, spiritual authority, and utopian ideals, influencing both popular culture and academic discourse. Moreover, Shambhala has contributed to the modern construction of Himalayan identity and Tibetan spirituality in global consciousness. Travel narratives, academic studies, and media portrayals collectively emphasize the region's mystery, elevation, and ethical paradigms, often intertwining landscape, myth, and cultural ideals. This process has reinforced the perception of the Himalayas as a repository of spiritual knowledge, positioning Shambhala as a cognitive and symbolic axis around which Western engagement with Tibetan culture has frequently revolved. In conclusion, Shambhala's cultural and ideological influence demonstrates that its significance extends well beyond ritual or doctrinal practice. Across literature, exploration, philosophical movements, and global media, the kingdom functions as a nexus of ethical, imaginative, and spiritual projection, shaping perceptions of Tibet, the Himalayas, and esoteric knowledge. Modern reception underscores the conceptual resilience of Shambhala, showing how a doctrinally rooted, geographically speculative kingdom can evolve into a multifaceted symbol in global intellectual and cultural history. With its cultural reach established, the final section presents a comprehensive academic assessment, integrating textual, ritual, and global perspectives to conclude Shambhala's historical and intellectual legacy. After more than a millennium of commentaries, Shambhala stands as a significant doctrinal and cultural idea rather than a historical kingdom. The accumulated evidence across textual, ritual, archaeological, and cultural domains supports a clear academic conclusion. Shambhala does not correspond to a verifiable political entity, but functions as a doctrinal construct within Tibetan Buddhist cosmology. Canonical sources, including the Kalachakra Tantra and early Tibetan commentaries, systematically present Shambhala as a kingdom governed by moral and ethical principles, embedded within cosmological cycles and eschatological narratives. The 32-king lineage, the succession of Kalki rulers, and the prophetic Rudra Chakran cycle collectively underscore its role as a structured pedagogical and ritual model rather than a historically attested polity. Historically, Shambhala evolved alongside the spread of Buddhism into the Himalayan plateau. Early Indic motifs of remote utopian lands merged with Tibetan scholastic interpretations, producing a geographically and cosmologically situated kingdom within textual frameworks. Over centuries, sectarian debates, from Sakya and Kagyu to rhyme angelic authorities, reinterpreted its symbolic, literal, and visionary aspects, reflecting shifts in philosophical orientation, ritual practice, and monastic administration. Scholarly analysis confirms that while Shambhala's narrative was adapted to political and doctrinal contexts, including Mongol patronage and angelic institutionalization, its purpose remained primarily symbolic and pedagogical. Cultural reception further illustrates Shambhala's ideational resilience. Western Orientalists, theosophists, adventure writers, and modern media adapted its imagery into global narratives of hidden wisdom, utopian society, and spiritual mastery. Explorers such as Rurik and Schlagentweit, alongside theosophical figures like Blavatsky and Bailey, projected Shambhala into wider intellectual and imaginative frameworks, creating a reception history that is culturally rich but doctrinally distinct from Tibetan sources. Literature, cinema, and interactive media continue this pattern, using Shambhala as a symbolic reference point rather than as a site of empirical or historical verification. Interpretive insights drawn from this multidisciplinary evidence emphasize three critical points. First, Shambhala functions as a conceptual and ethical anchor, guiding meditation, moral reasoning, and communal identity within Tibetan Buddhism. Second, its historical evolution demonstrates adaptive doctrinal flexibility, showing how symbolic frameworks respond to institutional, philosophical, and geopolitical change. Third, its cross-cultural migration illustrates the transformation of textual motifs into global cultural symbols, enabling Shambhala to mediate between rigorous scholarship, spiritual practice, and imaginative reception. Contemporary academic scholarship corroborates these conclusions. Critical philology, historical contextualization, and comparative studies, exemplified by the work of David Rigel, Jeffrey Samuel, Vesna Wallace, and John Newman, consistently differentiate canonical Kalachakra interpretations from modern mythologizations. Rigorous evaluation of archaeological surveys, geographic modeling, and textual cross-references confirms that Shambhala's supposed physical locations, ranging from the Altai to far northern Tibet, remain speculative, with no empirical corroboration. Instead, its significance lies in symbolic, cosmological, and pedagogical domains. Moreover, the assessment of Shambhala integrates doctrinal, ritual, and cultural dimensions into a cohesive analytical framework. Its canonical role as a model polity, ethical exemplar, and cosmological axis interacts with historical institutionalization and global reception, demonstrating the layered and enduring nature of the concept. From early Kalachakra commentaries to global meditation practices, Shambhala serves as a unifying thread across centuries, bridging scholarly analysis, religious practice, and imaginative appropriation. In conclusion, Shambhala's historical and intellectual legacy is both profound and multifaceted. Within Tibetan Buddhism, it structures ritual practice, ethical instruction, and doctrinal scholarship. Across cultures, it informs literature, exploration narratives, esoteric traditions, and popular imagination. Its enduring appeal lies in the coherence of its symbolic, cosmological, and ethical constructs, rather than in empirical historicity. By synthesizing textual, archaeological, and cultural evidence, scholars conclude that Shambhala is best understood as a doctrinally embedded, culturally resonant conceptual kingdom, a central axis of Buddhist thought and a source of ongoing inspiration for global audiences. From the high valleys of the Himalayas to the global meditation halls and the pages of modern literature, Shambhala remains a testament to the enduring power of symbolic geography, doctrinal imagination, and ethical vision, concluding a millennium-spanning narrative that is at once historical, religious, and cultural. If you found this exploration of Shambhala insightful, consider subscribing to stay informed on future deep dives into historical civilizations, esoteric traditions, and the hidden threads of human culture. Your engagement helps support accurate, research-driven storytelling and ensures these complex histories continue to reach a wider audience. Don't forget to like, share, and comment with your thoughts or questions. Your curiosity fuels our next journey into the past.